The midnight postman's last round. The town had grown quiet now, in that particular way that only comes after midnight, when the last voices have faded and the last doors have closed, and the streets remember what stillness feels like. The houses stood in their rows, dark windows reflecting nothing, curtains drawn against the night. Here and there a street lamp cast its circle of warm light onto the pavement below, steady and patient, asking nothing of the darkness around it. The air had cooled. Not cold, but cool enough to be noticed, the kind of temperature that makes the night feel clean and deliberate. A gentle breath of wind moved through occasionally, just enough to stir a leaf or two, then passed on, leaving everything as it had been. In the small post office on Elm Street, a single light burned in the back room. The postman was preparing for his final round of the night. His name was Thomas, though few people thought of him by name anymore. He had been the midnight postman for so many years that he had become simply a part of the town's sleeping hours, as expected and unremarkable as the church clock striking one, or the way the street lamps flickered on at dusk. Thomas moved slowly through his preparations. There was no hurry. There never was, not at this hour. He sorted through the letters that had arrived on the late train, his hands moving with the practiced certainty of routine. Each envelope passed through his fingers, addresses read without effort, routes forming in his mind like paths he had walked 1,000 times before. The letters were ordinary. A birthday card, perhaps late, but sent with good intentions. A bill from the electric company, printed in neat rows of numbers. A postcard from the coast, showing a pier stretching into blue water. A letter in careful handwriting, the kind someone takes time with, thinking of the person who will open it. Thomas placed them in his leather satchel, one by one. The satchel was old, worn soft at the edges, the strap shaped to his shoulder after years of carrying. It settled against his side with familiar weight. He checked his list. 37 addresses tonight. The western neighborhoods first, then winding back through the high street, ending near the park where the oldest houses stood behind their iron gates and hedge walls. When everything was ready, Thomas turned off the back room light and stepped out into the night. The street was empty. The shops along Elm Street had been closed for hours, their windows dark, their awnings rolled up. The bakery, the greengrocer, the small bookshop with its faded sign, all sleeping. Thomas could hear his own footsteps on the pavement, a soft, rhythmic sound that seemed to belong to the night itself. He walked at a steady pace, not fast, not slow. There was a particular rhythm to walking at midnight, a tempo that matched the quietness around him. His footsteps echoed gently off the buildings, then faded into the stillness. The first street lamp he passed glowed with a warm, amber light. Thomas paused beneath it for a moment, as he often did, letting his eyes adjust, feeling the night settle around him. The lamp hummed very quietly, a sound so soft it was almost imagined. Somewhere far away, a church clock began to strike the hour. 1, 2, 3. The sound carried across the rooftops, clear and unhurried. 12 times the bell rang, marking midnight's passage into the deepest part of the night. When the last note faded, Thomas continued on his way. He turned left onto Chestnut Road, where the houses sat back from the street behind small front gardens. The gardens were dark, but he could make out the shapes of rose bushes and hedges, the gleam of a garden gate, the outline of a bicycle leaning against a wall. The first house was number 14. A red door, a brass letterbox polished to a soft shine. Thomas reached into his satchel and withdrew a single envelope, a letter from someone's daughter, judging by the return address. He lifted the letterbox flap with one finger. It opened smoothly, without sound. He slid the envelope through, heard the whisper of it landing on the mat inside, then let the flap close with the softest of clicks. One letter delivered. The night received this small action without comment. Nothing changed. The house continued sleeping. The street remained still. Thomas walked on to the next house, and then the next. At number 18, he delivered 2 letters and a catalog. At number 22, a single postcard showing mountains at sunset. At number 26, a small package wrapped in brown paper, light enough to fit through the slot. Each time, the same gentle ritual. The opening of the letterbox, the soft slide of paper, the quiet click as it closed, footsteps continuing. The street lamps marked his progress, one circle of light following another. Between them, shadows pooled and rested. Thomas moved through both light and shadow, his pace never varying, his breathing steady and calm. A cat appeared from beneath a hedge, paused to regard him with luminous eyes, then moved on about its own nighttime business. Thomas watched it go, a silent shadow flowing over a garden wall and disappearing into darkness. He reached the end of Chestnut Road and turned onto Willow Lane. Here the trees grew thick along both sides, their branches meeting overhead to form a tunnel of leaves. The street lamps were fewer here, their light filtering through the foliage in patterns of soft gold and deeper black. The air beneath the trees felt different, quieter somehow, more enclosed. Thomas could hear his footsteps more clearly here, and the sound of the leaves moving in the gentle wind. The occasional creak of a branch. The rustle of some small creature in the undergrowth. He delivered letters to the houses along Willow Lane with the same care as before. Number 7, a thick envelope, official-looking. Number 9, 3 letters, all different sizes. Number 13, nothing tonight. He paused at that gate anyway, as he always did, checking his list twice, ensuring he hadn't missed anything. The routine mattered. The certainty of it, the way each action followed the last in perfect order. At the end of Willow Lane, the road opened up again, and Thomas found himself at the edge of the High Street. Even at this hour, the High Street retained something of its daytime character, the sense of being the town's center, the place where paths crossed and purposes met. But now, emptied of people and activity, it had become something else. A stage without actors, a sentence without words. Thomas walked down the center of the street. There was no traffic to avoid, no need to keep to the pavement. His footsteps echoed off the shop fronts on either side, creating a rhythm that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The clock tower rose at the far end of the High Street, its face luminous against the dark sky. midnight now. The hands moved so slowly they seemed not to move at all, yet they were always moving, always marking the night's patient progression. Thomas delivered letters to the flats above the shops. These required more effort, doorways to find, stairs to climb, landing lights to press. But he moved through these tasks with the same steady calm, never rushing, never hesitating. Each letterbox received its contents. Each door was left as quiet as he'd found it. When he emerged from the last building, the night seemed to have deepened somehow. The darkness between the street lamps had grown richer. The silence had settled more completely. Thomas adjusted his satchel and consulted his list. 18 addresses completed. 19 remaining. He set off toward the western neighborhoods, where the newer houses stood in neat rows, their gardens still young, their trees not yet tall enough to shade the pavements. The night continued its watch. The street lamps glowed, and Thomas walked on, carrying his letters through the sleeping town, a figure moving slowly through stillness, part of the night's own quiet breathing. The western neighborhoods began where the High Street ended, beyond the small roundabout with its circle of trimmed grass and the memorial stone that marked the town's center. Here the road spread out in a pattern that Thomas knew by heart, Meadowway leading to Sunset Close, which curved around to meet Birch Avenue, which in turn connected back to the main road through a series of smaller lanes and cul-de-sacs. Thomas took the left fork onto Meadowway. The houses here were younger than those in the older part of town, built perhaps 20 years ago, their bricks still holding a redness that hadn't yet weathered to softer tones. The front gardens were small but carefully tended. Even in the darkness, Thomas could make out the shapes of young trees staked upright, flower beds edged with stones, short driveways leading to garage doors. The street lamps here were different too, taller, casting a whiter light than the warm amber glow of the old town center. The light fell in clear circles on the pavement, precise and even. Thomas walked from circle to circle, his shadow appearing and disappearing, long and short, as he moved. Number 3 Meadowway, a letter with a window showing an address typed in neat lines. Thomas lifted the chrome letterbox flap. It moved stiffly, newer than most, not yet worn into smooth silence. The letter slid through and landed with a soft sound on the other side. Number 7, 2 letters, both in the same handwriting, both addressed to different people at the same house. Perhaps a mother writing separately to her 2 grown children who still lived at home. Or siblings, each receiving their own correspondence. Thomas didn't speculate much. The letters carried their own stories, private and complete, none of his concern beyond their safe delivery. Number 11, a package, slightly too large for the letterbox. Thomas walked up the short path to the front door, where a larger parcel box had been installed. He opened it carefully, placed the package inside, and closed it with barely a sound. A thoughtful addition, that box. It meant packages could be delivered without knocking, without disturbing the sleep within. The night air moved gently against his face as he returned to the pavement. Cool, but not uncomfortable. The kind of temperature that made walking pleasant, that kept the mind clear and alert without demanding attention. Thomas breathed it in slowly. The air tasted clean, carrying perhaps a hint of grass from the fields beyond the last houses, a trace of flowers from someone's garden. He continued along Meadow Way, delivering letters to numbers 13, 15, and 17. Then the road curved gently to the right, and the houses on one side gave way to a small park, just a square of grass really, with a bench and a young oak tree planted in the center, a wooden fence running along its edge. Thomas paused at the fence. He often did, at this point in his round. The park provided a different quality of darkness, an openness after the enclosed feeling of walking between houses. The grass stretched away into shadow. The oak tree stood silent in the center, its leaves rustling very softly when the breeze found them. The bench faced away from the road, looking out over the grass toward nothing in particular. Thomas wondered sometimes who sat there during the day. Elderly people perhaps, taking the sun. Young mothers with children. People eating lunch from paper bags, taking a break from work or errands. Now it sat empty, patient, waiting for morning. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, 3 short barks, then silence. Probably a dream, Thomas thought. Dogs dreamed, he knew. He'd had a dog once, years ago, and had watched it sleeping by the fire, its paws twitching, small sounds coming from its throat as it ran through some remembered or imagined chase. The memory came and went without weight. Just a moment from long ago, surfacing briefly before sinking back into the past where it belonged. Thomas turned away from the park and walked on. Meadow Way became sunset close here, though there was no actual break, just a sign marking where one road ended and another began. The houses continued in their orderly rows, each one similar to its neighbors but different in small ways. Different curtains in the windows, different cars in the driveways, different choices of door color and garden ornaments. Number 2 Sunset Close, a postcard from Spain, showing a white village climbing a hillside under a brilliant blue sky. The colors seemed almost too bright here in the darkness, as if the sunlight captured in the photograph was trying to shine out into the night. Thomas slipped it through the letterbox and moved on. Number 6, no delivery tonight. He checked his list twice to be certain, then continued. Number 8, a large envelope, the kind that holds documents that shouldn't be folded. Thomas maneuvered it carefully through the letterbox, hearing it slide down and land flat on the floor inside. The road curved again, following the contour of the land. Thomas could feel the gentle slope beneath his feet, a slight upward gradient that would continue for another 100 yards before leveling out. His pace didn't change. The slope was gradual enough to walk without effort, just noticeable enough to register in the muscles of his legs. At the top of the rise, Sunset Close opened onto Birch Avenue. This was a longer street, running straight for perhaps 200 yards before ending in a turning circle. Trees had been planted along both sides, birches true to the street's name, their white bark pale in the darkness, their delicate leaves moving continuously in the night breeze. Thomas liked this street. There was something peaceful about the way the trees lined it, the way their branches met overhead like the trees on Willow Lane, but with a lighter, more open feeling. Through the branches he could see the sky, deep and vast, scattered with stars that glittered with perfect steadiness. He walked down the center of Birch Avenue, his footsteps creating a rhythm that seemed to match the gentle movement of the leaves overhead. Step, 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 step. Steady and certain. No variation. No hurry. The first house that required a delivery was number 12. Thomas opened the gate, a low wooden gate that swung easily on well-oiled hinges, and walked up the path. The front garden here was larger than most, with flower beds running along both sides of the path, and a small rockery near the door where alpine plants grew between the stones. The letterbox was at the bottom of the door, the old-fashioned kind. Thomas crouched slightly to reach it, his knees complaining just a little, a reminder that he wasn't as young as he'd been when he first started this work. But the complaint was mild, familiar, easy to ignore. He slid 3 letters through the slot, heard them land one after another, then straightened and returned to the street. Number 16, 1 letter. Number 20, a catalog and 2 envelopes. Number 24, another postcard, this one showing mountains and a lake. The rhythm continued. Gate, path, letterbox, return. The actions repeated until they became almost meditative, thought giving way to simple doing, the mind quiet and the body moving through its practiced routine. Halfway down Birch Avenue, a street lamp was flickering slightly. Not broken, just old perhaps, or affected by some minor electrical fluctuation. The light dimmed and brightened, creating a gentle pulse that Thomas found oddly soothing. He paused beneath it, watching the light change, the shadows around him shifting slightly with each pulse. Flicker. Pause. Flicker. Pause. The rhythm was slow, like breathing, like a heartbeat at rest. Thomas stood there for perhaps a minute, perhaps more. Time felt different at night, especially this deep into the night. Minutes stretched. Moments expanded. There was no hurry, no pressure, no reason to move faster than the night itself moved. Eventually he walked on, leaving the flickering lamp behind. It would probably sort itself out, or the council would replace it during the next maintenance round. Some things fixed themselves. Others got fixed in due course. Very little required immediate action. The end of Birch Avenue came gradually into view, the turning circle where the road looped back on itself, the houses facing inward around the curve. Thomas delivered letters to 3 of these houses, walking around the circle, his path describing a gentle arc. The last house on Birch Avenue was number 42. It sat slightly apart from the others, separated by a line of hedges on one side and a wooden fence on the other. The front garden was overgrown, not untidy exactly, but allowed to grow more freely than its neighbors. Long grass, bushes that spread where they wished, flowers that had seated themselves in unexpected places. Thomas delivered a single envelope, a handwritten letter with an old-fashioned stamp in the corner. He wondered briefly about the person who lived here, who they were, what they thought about as they looked out at their wild garden. But the wondering was gentle, without any need for answers. He retraced his steps, walking back along Birch Avenue the way he had come. The flickering street lamp was still flickering. The birch trees still rustled overhead. Nothing had changed, and yet the street felt different now that he'd walked its length, more familiar, more known, as if the act of passing through had created some small connection. At the intersection, Thomas turned left onto Harper Lane, a smaller road that would lead him eventually back toward the older part of town. The houses here were mixed, some newer like those on Meadow Way and Sunset Close, others older, probably built between the wars, their styles creating a patchwork of different eras sitting side by side. The night was deepening now, moving past midnight into that stretch of hours that belonged entirely to darkness, when even the memory of evening had faded and morning was still unimaginable. This was Thomas's favorite time, when the town rested most completely, when the silence was most profound. He walked on through the quiet streets, his satchel lighter now with each delivery, his route unwinding before him like a path he'd walked in dreams, familiar beyond thought, certain beyond question. Harper Lane descended gently as it curved away from Birch Avenue, following the natural slope of the land down toward the stream that ran along the eastern edge of town. Thomas could feel the gradient change beneath his feet, his stride adjusting without conscious thought to the downward pull. The street lamps here were spaced farther apart, creating longer intervals of shadow between the pools of light. The houses on Harper Lane had a quieter feeling to them, set back farther from the road, their gardens deeper. Many had driveways that curved away into darkness, leading to garages hidden behind trees or tucked beside the houses. Thomas could see the shapes of cars parked in these driveways, their windows blank and dark, waiting patiently for morning in motion. Number 5 Harper Lane, a bungalow with a low-pitched roof and wide windows that during the day probably let in generous light. Now the windows reflected only darkness and the distant glow of street lamps. Thomas walked up the driveway, his footsteps quieter on the gravel than they'd been on pavement. The sound of the small stones shifting under his weight seemed loud in the stillness, but it was a good sound, an honest sound, nothing to apologize for. The letterbox was beside the front door, mounted on the wall at a convenient height. 2 letters tonight, one official-looking, one personal. Thomas slid them through and heard them land on what sounded like a small table or shelf just inside. A sensible arrangement, he thought. No bending to pick letters up off the floor. He walked back down the gravel drive, the stones crunching softly, and returned to the pavement. Number 9, set even farther back, at the end of a longer driveway lined with lavender bushes. Even this late in the year, even in the darkness, Thomas could catch the faint scent of lavender as he passed between the bushes. The smell was subtle, almost ghostly, a memory of summer carried into this autumn night. The letter he delivered here was thin, perhaps just a single sheet folded inside an envelope. It whispered through the letterbox and was gone. Number 13 Harper Lane was dark like all the others, but as Thomas approached, he noticed a small light in one of the upstairs windows. Not the main light, but something dimmer, softer. A nightlight perhaps, or someone reading in bed unable to sleep, or simply someone who preferred not to wake in complete darkness. Thomas found this comforting somehow. The idea that he wasn't the only one awake in the town, that somewhere behind these quiet walls, other consciousness persisted through the night hours. Not that he felt lonely. He didn't. The solitude of his midnight rounds suited him perfectly. But still, there was something reassuring about that single lit window, that small proof of other wakefulness. He delivered a package here, small enough for the letterbox, but only just. It required careful angling to fit through, but he managed it without force, without sound. The package disappeared into the darkness beyond the slot, and Thomas continued on his way. The road curved again, following the line of the stream, though the water itself wasn't visible from here, hidden behind a row of back gardens and a line of trees. But Thomas could sense its presence, could almost hear it moving over stones in its shallow bed, though perhaps that was imagination rather than actual sound. He'd walked along that stream during the day, years ago, following the path that ran beside it. The water was clear and quick-moving, breaking into white foam where it ran over rocks, slowing into dark pools where the bed deepened. Fish lived in those pools, he'd seen them sometimes, small shadows hovering in the current. And birds came to drink at the edges, and insects danced above the surface on summer evenings. But that was daytime, sunlit memory. Now the stream flowed on in darkness, unconcerned with being seen, following its ancient course from somewhere higher in the hills down eventually to the river that ran through the valley beyond the town. Everything continued in the darkness. Everything flowed and grew and moved through its cycles, whether witnessed or not. Thomas found this thought peaceful. The world didn't need an audience. It simply was completely and entirely itself, in light and in darkness equally. Harper Lane ended at a T-junction with Old Mill Road. Thomas turned right, heading back toward the center of town now, his route beginning its return loop. Old Mill Road was wider than Harper Lane, with pavements on both sides and a line of horse chestnuts growing at intervals along the verge. The trees were old, their trunks thick, their branches spreading wide. In autumn they dropped their conkers, glossy brown nuts in their spiky green cases, and children gathered them for games and collections. But the conkers were mostly gone now, already fallen and collected or rotted into the earth, leaving only the trees standing in their patient way, waiting for winter, then spring, then summer, then autumn again, the cycle turning as it always turned. Thomas walked beneath these trees, his shadow shortening and lengthening as he passed from street lamp to street lamp. The houses here were older, Victorian perhaps, or Edwardian, built when the town was smaller, and this road marked its edge rather than passing through its middle. They were substantial houses, 3 stories tall with bay windows and steep roofs. Many had been divided into flats now, evidenced by the multiple doorbells beside the front doors and the clusters of different curtains in different windows. Thomas's list showed several deliveries here, different names at the same address, different flats within the same building. Number 12 Old Mill Road, 3 letters, 2 for flat A and 1 for flat B. Thomas opened the main front door with care. It was unlocked, as such doors often were, allowing access to the communal hallway and the stairs leading to the flats above. Inside, the hallway was dark but not completely. A small lamp on a timer provided a dim glow, enough to see by. The hallway smelled of old wood and cleaning products and cooking smells from earlier in the evening. The carpet runner up the stairs was worn in the middle, where feet had trodden for decades. Everything here had weight, history, the accumulated presence of all the people who had passed through over the years. 2 letterboxes were mounted on the wall, one labeled A, one labeled B. Thomas distributed the letters accordingly, heard them fall into the baskets that had been hung behind the boxes to catch them. Then he returned to the street, closing the door quietly behind him. The night had grown cooler now, moving toward that hour when temperature drops most notably, when dew begins to form and metal feels cold to the touch. Thomas didn't mind. He dressed appropriately, his uniform jacket was warm enough, and the walking kept his blood moving, kept his body at a comfortable temperature despite the chill in the air. Number 16, another divided house, this one with 4 flats. Thomas made his way up to the second floor where flat C was located, climbing stairs that creaked softly under his weight. He slid a single letter under the flat's door. The letterbox was broken, he knew from previous rounds, and the occupant had asked that mail be left on the floor instead. Back down the stairs, out into the night. The street was as empty as before. As empty as it had been for the last hour. As empty as it would remain until morning brought the first stirrings of the day. Thomas crossed the road to number 23. A semi-detached house with a small front garden behind a low wall. A single letter tonight, an airmail envelope, thin and light, postmarked from Australia. The stamp showed a colorful bird, red and blue and green. Someone far away, reaching across the distance with words on paper. The letterbox accepted the envelope easily. Thomas heard it land and settle. Somewhere inside the sleeping house, someone would find it in the morning, would open it and read words written on the other side of the world, carried across oceans and continents to arrive here, at this door, in this quiet town. The thought pleased Thomas in some way he couldn't quite articulate. The persistence of it, the faith involved, that a letter posted in Sydney would find its way to this particular house on this particular street in this particular country. The system worked. Letters got delivered. Messages reached their destinations. It was simple and reliable and good. He continued along Old Mill Road, delivering to houses on both sides of the street now, crossing back and forth, his path zigzagging gradually along the road's length. The rhythm was pleasing. Deliver on the left, cross the street, deliver on the right, cross back. Each crossing a small journey, each delivery a small completion. Number 31, 2 postcards and a magazine. Number 35, a single envelope, hand-addressed in careful script. Number 39, a catalog and what felt like a greeting card in a square envelope. The letterboxes varied, some new and stiff, some old and smooth with use. Some made noise when opened, some were silent. Some had brushes inside to keep out drafts, tickling against the back of Thomas's hand as he pushed letters through. He knew them all, each one's particular character, though he'd never thought about this knowledge consciously until now. Old Mill Road began to rise slightly as it approached the junction with the high street. Thomas felt his legs working a little harder against the gradient, his breathing deepening just a fraction. But the slope was gentle, nothing challenging, just enough to notice. At the top of the rise, the high street opened before him again, the clock tower visible in the distance, its face showing 1:30 now. Time passing as it always did, steady and indifferent and reliable. Thomas turned left, walking back through the high street, but this time he crossed to the northern side, where he hadn't delivered earlier. More shops here, a butcher's, a hardware store, a charity shop with its window display of donated items waiting for new homes. Above these shops were more flats, and Thomas had deliveries for several of them. He worked his way along the row, finding doorways, climbing stairs, delivering letters into boxes or under doors, or wherever the occupants preferred their mail left. The work was methodical, precise. Each delivery completed with the same care as the first, as the 100th, as the 1000th. No letter was less important than any other. Each one mattered to someone. Each one deserved his attention. When he emerged from the last building, Thomas paused and looked up at the sky. The stars seemed brighter now, sharper, as if the deepening night had polished them to greater brilliance. He could see the plow clearly, and Orion rising in the east, the 3 stars of his belt perfectly aligned. The air was still. No wind now. Just the coolness and the quiet and the stars watching from their immeasurable distances. Thomas checked his list. He was past halfway now, the bulk of his deliveries completed. What remained was the eastern part of town, the older residential streets near the park, the area of large houses and established gardens where the town's first families had built their homes. He adjusted his satchel and set off toward those quieter streets, his footsteps resuming their steady rhythm, carrying him deeper into the night's embrace. The eastern part of town began where the high street narrowed and became Park Road, a name that had probably made sense when the road was first laid out and the park was a new addition to the town's geography. Now the park was old, its trees mature, its paths worn smooth by generations of feet, and the road seemed simply to flow naturally into the quieter residential area, as if it had always been so. Thomas walked along Park Road with the same steady pace he'd maintained all night. The street lamps here were the old style again, the warm amber lights that glowed rather than shone, that created atmosphere rather than simple illumination. They stood at regular intervals, each one casting its pool of soft light onto the pavement below. The houses that lined Park Road sat well back from the street, separated by deep front gardens and low stone walls or hedges trimmed into neat geometric shapes. These were the houses of the town's earlier prosperity, built when there was space to spare and gardens were considered essential rather than luxury. Large windows looked out from behind curtains or shutters. Chimneys rose from slate roofs. Here and there, a conservatory had been added to the side of a house, its glass panels dark now but promising brightness when the sun returned. Thomas could see the park itself through gaps in the houses, dark expanses of grass, the silhouettes of trees against the slightly lighter sky, the pale line of a path cutting across the darkness. The park at night was a different place than the park by day. Quiet instead of busy, still instead of active, given over to foxes and hedgehogs and the occasional owl, rather than to joggers and children and people walking dogs. He had walked through the park many times during daylight hours, on his days off or before his shift began. He knew its layout, the bandstand in the center, the pond at the southern end where ducks gathered, the rose garden near the northern gate, the children's playground with its swings and slides. All of it was there now in the darkness, unchanged but invisible, waiting for morning to make it real again. Number 8 Park Road was his first delivery here, a large house with ivy growing up one wall and a magnolia tree in the front garden. The magnolia was bare now, its branches spreading in elegant patterns against the darkness, but in spring it would be covered in white flowers, each one like a small flame of purity against the sky. The letterbox was set into the front door, which stood at the top of 3 stone steps. Thomas climbed the steps, feeling their solidity beneath his feet. The stone was worn smooth in the center, where feet had stepped for perhaps 100 years or more. He delivered 2 letters, both official-looking, brown envelopes with typed addresses and franked stamps. Back down the steps, back to the pavement, on to the next house. Number 12 was set even farther back, reached by a gravel drive that curved between rhododendron bushes. The bushes were overgrown, creating a tunnel effect as Thomas walked between them. His footsteps on the gravel seemed louder here, amplified by the enclosing vegetation. The sound didn't disturb him. It was simply what walking on gravel sounded like, honest and straightforward and unavoidable. The house itself was imposing, 3 stories with multiple chimneys and a front door flanked by pillars. But the grandeur felt faded, comfortable rather than intimidating. The paint was slightly weathered. The brass doorknob had dulled to a soft gleam. Everything spoke of age accepted gracefully, of maintenance done regularly but without fuss. 1 letter for this house, a small envelope, personal rather than business. Thomas slid it through the letterbox and heard it land somewhere far inside, the sound echoing slightly in what must be a large entrance hall. He walked back down the gravel drive, the rhododendrons pressing close on either side. When he emerged onto the pavement again, the openness felt sudden, welcome. The sky spread above him, vast and patient. The street lamps glowed in their gentle way. Number 16 Park Road was different from its neighbors, smaller, newer, built perhaps in the 1930s when the original large gardens had been divided and sold off. It was a neat house, well maintained, with a tiled path leading to the front door and a small lawn on either side, perfectly level and evenly cut. 3 letters tonight and a small package. Thomas delivered them all through the letterbox, which was new and bright and made a satisfying click when it closed. The house seemed to accept its deliveries and settle back into silence. The road curved gently to the left, following the edge of the park. Through the iron railings that bordered the park, Thomas could see more clearly now. The grass rolling away into darkness, a bench beneath a tree, the outline of the bandstand perhaps 100 yards distant. The railings were Victorian, each one topped with a small decorative finial, and they ran the entire length of the park's boundary, marking the division between public and private space. Thomas walked beside these railings for some time, delivering letters to the houses on his right while the park stretched away on his left. The combination was pleasant, the solidity of the houses on one side, the openness of the park on the other, and himself moving between them, connecting them in some small way through his presence and his work. Number 24, a letter from the tax office. Number 28, 2 birthday cards in pastel-colored envelopes. Number 32, a magazine subscription and a bank statement. Each house received what had come for it. Each letterbox opened and closed. Each delivery added to the night's accumulation of small, completed tasks. At number 36, a cat was sitting on the gate post. It watched Thomas approach with the typical feline expression of polite disinterest, as if his arrival was barely worth noting, but would be observed nonetheless out of curiosity. The cat was black with white paws, clearly well-fed and cared for. Thomas paused at the gate. The cat blinked slowly, that particular cat gesture that seemed to convey both acknowledgement and dismissal. Thomas nodded to it, a small gesture of recognition, then walked up the path to deliver his letters. When he returned, the cat was still there, sitting in exactly the same position, its tail wrapped neatly around its front paws. "Good evening," Thomas said quietly, surprising himself. He rarely spoke during his rounds, even to animals, but the cat seemed to merit the courtesy. The cat blinked again, but offered no other response. Thomas smiled slightly and continued on his way. Park Road eventually curved away from the park itself, heading deeper into the residential area. The houses here were varied, some large and old like those he'd passed earlier, others smaller and more modern, inserted into gaps where older buildings had been demolished or gardens subdivided. The mix created an interesting rhythm as Thomas walked, old, new, old, new, each building speaking of a different era, different priorities, different ways of thinking about home and space and comfort. Number 43 was one of the modern houses, all clean lines and large windows, and a front garden that was more gravel than grass, designed for minimal maintenance. The letterbox was a slot in the wall beside the door, modern like everything else. Thomas delivered a single catalog and moved on. Number 47 was old again, probably Edwardian, with decorative brickwork and a stained glass panel above the door. The glass caught the streetlight and glowed softly, reds and blues and ambers creating a pattern of abstract beauty. Thomas had always liked that panel. He saw it every night, and every night it pleased him in the same quiet way. 2 letters tonight, both handwritten, both posted locally judging by the postmarks. Perhaps correspondence between friends who lived in the same town, but preferred to write rather than phone or visit. There was something lovely in that, Thomas thought. The deliberateness of it, the time taken to compose thoughts in written words, to find an envelope, to walk to the postbox, to trust the system to carry those words to their destination. He delivered the letters and walked on. The street branched here, splitting into 2 smaller roads, Adelaide Terrace and Victoria Gardens. Both were short, both lined with similar houses, both quiet and dark. Thomas took Adelaide Terrace first, working his way along its length, delivering to alternate houses, number 3, number 7, number 11. The houses here were terraced, joined together in a continuous row, their front doors opening directly onto the pavement. No front gardens here, no space between house and street. But the houses had character, each one painted a different color, each door unique, each window dressed differently from its neighbors. The effect was cheerful even in darkness, a sense of individuality within uniformity. At number 15, Thomas delivered what felt like a birthday card, a thick envelope with a slight stiffness that suggested a card rather than just paper. He imagined someone's birthday approaching, someone waking tomorrow to find this waiting for them. A small moment of celebration arriving through the letterbox, delivered by night while they slept. He reached the end of Adelaide Terrace and doubled back along Victoria Gardens. More deliveries here, number 2, number 8, number 14. The work continued in its steady way, each action like the one before, each completion leading naturally to the next. A church clock struck somewhere, not the main clock in the town center, but a smaller one closer. 2 measured chimes carrying clearly through the still air. 2 in the morning now. The deepest part of night, when sleep is heaviest and dreams most vivid, and the world belongs entirely to silence and shadow. Thomas felt the hours settling around him like a familiar coat. This was his time, these hours between midnight and dawn. He was awake and moving while others slept. He saw the town in its most private moments, when it had removed its public face and simply existed, unobserved and unperformed. There was privilege in that, he felt. Not that he would have described it that way if asked. But there was something special about being witness to the town's sleeping hours, about moving through streets that belonged temporarily to night itself. He finished Victoria Gardens and returned to Park Road, which had now become Queensway, the same road, just a different name for a different section. The houses here were grander again, set in even larger gardens, many surrounded by walls rather than hedges, with gates that were closed and sometimes locked. For these houses, Thomas couldn't always walk to the door. Instead, letterboxes had been installed in the walls beside the gates, or in the gatepost itself, allowing mail to be delivered without entering the property. Thomas appreciated this practicality. It made his work simpler, more efficient, and there was something satisfying about the way these external letterboxes had been incorporated into the walls and gates, becoming part of the architecture rather than afterthoughts. Number 4 Queensway, a letterbox set into a brick gatepost. One letter, official looking. Number 8, a letterbox in the wall, painted to match the wall's cream color. 2 letters and a small package. Number 12, a more elaborate arrangement, with a brass letterbox that looked like a miniature door, complete with tiny hinges and a handle. Each one received its deliveries. Each one held its contents safely behind closed doors until morning brought collection and opening and reading. The night continued its slow progression. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The street lamps burned steadily. And Thomas walked on, his satchel growing lighter, his route unfolding exactly as planned, carrying him deeper into the quiet eastern neighborhoods where the oldest houses stood and the newest dreams were dreaming themselves into morning. Queensway continued for another half-mile, running parallel to the park's eastern boundary before curving gradually northward. The houses here became fewer, spaced farther apart, each one sitting in grounds that were more estate than garden. Stone walls 8 or 10 feet high enclosed these properties, their tops sometimes visible above carefully maintained hedges, sometimes standing bare against the sky. Thomas walked along the pavement at a steady pace, his footsteps the only sound in the stillness. Between the street lamps, the darkness was deeper here, less interrupted by ambient light from windows or other sources. The houses were set too far back, too well insulated by their walls and trees and distance. The darkness felt complete in those intervals, almost solid, as if the night had weight and presence. But Thomas didn't mind the darkness. He'd long ago lost any childhood fear of it. Darkness was simply the absence of light, nothing more threatening than that. And his eyes had adjusted hours ago, learning to see in the dim glow of street lamps, learning to judge distances and depths by subtle variations in shadow. Number 16 Queensway had a letterbox mounted in its wall, just beside an imposing set of iron gates. The gates were painted black and decorated with gilt finials. Through the bars, Thomas could see a long driveway disappearing into shadow, and beyond that the suggestion of a large house, though most of it was hidden by trees and darkness. He delivered 2 letters, both in cream-colored envelopes with handwritten addresses in elegant script. The kind of letters that suggested thank-you notes or formal invitations, correspondence conducted with attention to form and courtesy. The letterbox closed with a soft metallic sound, and Thomas moved on. Between houses, the wall was interrupted occasionally by the branches of trees that grew within the grounds, reaching over the top to spread their canopy above the pavement. Thomas walked beneath these branches, feeling the slight difference in the air, cooler, perhaps, or damper, or simply different in some way he couldn't quite name. The trees were mostly deciduous, their leaves gone now except for a few stragglers that rustled dryly when the occasional breath of wind found them. An owl called from somewhere within the park, a long, wavering note that rose and fell, and then faded into silence. Thomas paused, listening, but the call didn't repeat. The owl had said what it needed to say and moved on, hunting or simply announcing its presence to the night. Number 20 Queensway was the last house on this stretch before the road curved away from the park. Another letterbox in the wall, this one painted dark green to match the gates beside it. 1 letter tonight, a business envelope with a typed address. Thomas delivered it and continued around the curve. Here Queensway began to descend slightly, following the land as it sloped down toward the stream that marked the town's eastern boundary. The houses on this section were different again, smaller than the grand estates he'd just passed, but older, built perhaps in the mid-1800s when the town had first begun to expand beyond its medieval core. These were solid Victorian villas, substantial without being ostentatious, each one sitting in a garden of perhaps half an acre. The gardens were more visible here, not hidden behind high walls, and Thomas could make out the shapes of mature trees and shrubs, the suggestions of lawn and flower bed, the occasional garden ornament or sundial or bird bath. Number 25 had a particularly beautiful garden, even in its winter state. Thomas had seen it in summer, when roses climbed the front wall and lavender lined the path, and the flower beds were full of color. Now it was dormant, resting, gathering strength for spring. But the structure was still there, the carefully planned layout, the mature plantings, the sense of a garden that had been tended with love and attention for many years. 2 letters for this house, both personal. Thomas walked up the path, which was made of old brick laid in a herringbone pattern, worn smooth by decades of use. The letterbox was brass, polished to a warm shine even in the darkness. The letters slid through easily and landed with a soft sound on what might have been a doormat. At number 29, the house was set back even farther, reached by a short driveway that split to circle around a central flower bed. In summer, that bed would be full of roses. Thomas remembered them from previous rounds, their scent carrying on warm evening air. Now the bed was bare soil, the roses cut back to stubs, waiting for spring's signal to begin growing again. One letter tonight, thin, official-looking. Thomas delivered it and returned to the road. The descent continued, gradual but steady. Thomas could feel it in his stride, in the way his weight settled slightly forward, in the different engagement of muscles in his legs. Going downhill was easier than climbing, but it required attention in a different way, a need to control momentum, to not let gravity increase his pace beyond what was comfortable and sustainable. The street lamps grew slightly more frequent here, perhaps because the road was older, dating from an era when lighting standards were different. Each lamp stood on its ornate iron post, the design unchanged since they were first installed perhaps a century ago. Some still bore the name of the foundry that had cast them, raised letters in the metal that read Harrison & Sons, Birmingham, 1903. Thomas appreciated these details, though he rarely thought about them consciously. They were simply part of the landscape he moved through, familiar markers that confirmed he was where he thought he was, following the route he knew so well. Number 33 Queensway, a letter and a small parcel. Number 37, 3 letters, all different sizes. Number 41, a single postcard showing a beach and palm trees, somewhere warm and distant. The deliveries continued in their rhythm. Thomas's hands knew the motions without thought now. Reach into the satchel, withdraw the correct items, approach the door, open the letterbox, slide the mail through, close the letterbox, return to the pavement. Each sequence identical in form, different only in detail. At number 45, a dog barked from somewhere behind the house. Not an angry bark, but a questioning one, as if the dog had heard Thomas's footsteps on the path and wanted to investigate. The bark came once, twice, then stopped. Perhaps the dog's owner had quieted it, or perhaps the dog had satisfied itself that the sound was nothing requiring further attention. Thomas stood still for a moment, listening. But there was no more barking, no sound of movement from within the house. Just the continued silence of sleeping occupants and a dog returning to its own sleep. He delivered the letters, 2 of them, and moved on. Queensway ended at a T-junction with Riverside Road. To the left, the road led toward the town center, back the way Thomas had come though by a different route. To the right, it led toward the actual riverside, where houses gave way to fields and the stream became wider and deeper as it approached its confluence with the river. Thomas turned right, following his planned route. He had several deliveries on Riverside Road, then a loop back through the streets that lay between here and the town center, Maple Drive, Orchard Lane, and finally back to the High Street where his round would conclude. Riverside Road was quieter even than Queensway had been. The houses here were more scattered, separated by larger gaps where trees grew or where gardens had been allowed to become almost wild, managed just enough to maintain boundaries but otherwise left to nature's preferences. The road itself was narrower, barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass. No pavement here, just the road itself, with a grass verge on either side. Thomas walked on the road, keeping to the left side out of habit, though there was no traffic to worry about at this hour. The sound of the stream was audible now, a soft, constant murmur that came from somewhere beyond the trees and gardens on his right. Water moving over stones, following its downhill path, patient and persistent and eternal. The sound was soothing, a natural accompaniment to the night's quiet. Number 12 Riverside Road was a cottage, small and old, with a thatched roof and walls that had probably once been white, but had weathered to a softer cream color. Roses grew around the door, bare branches now but promising beauty in their season. The letterbox was low, set into the bottom of the door itself, requiring Thomas to bend down to reach it. His knees protested slightly. That same small complaint they'd made earlier, nothing serious, just age making itself known. He delivered the single letter, handwritten, addressed in a flowing script, and straightened carefully. The cottage seemed particularly peaceful in the darkness, tucked into its garden like something from a children's story. Thomas imagined the interior, low ceilings probably, exposed beams, small windows, a fireplace. The kind of house that would be cozy in winter, cool in summer, always slightly dim inside regardless of the season. He walked on, the stream's murmur growing gradually louder as the road approached it more closely. Through gaps in the vegetation, he caught glimpses of water, dark and quick-moving, reflecting nothing in the darkness, just flowing steadily on its way. Number 16 was set right at the water's edge, its back garden running down to the stream bank. A footbridge crossed the stream here, leading to a field on the far side, though the bridge looked private, probably belonging to the house. Thomas delivered 2 letters and a magazine, then paused to look at the stream. It was perhaps 10 feet wide at this point, shallow enough that he could see the pale stones of its bed even in the dim light. The water moved quickly, creating small sounds as it divided around rocks and flowed over shallows. The smell of water and wet earth rose from it, clean and fresh and somehow alive. Thomas stood there for perhaps a minute, watching the water flow, listening to its continuous song. There was something mesmerizing about moving water, something that drew the eye and quieted the mind. The stream had been flowing like this for thousands of years, long before the town existed, long before any human had built a house beside it or planted a garden on its banks. And it would continue flowing long after all of those things were gone, patient and indifferent and eternal. Eventually he turned away and continued along the road. 3 more houses on Riverside Road, then the turn onto Maple Drive that would begin his route back toward the center. The night was at its deepest now, that hour when even restless sleepers find rest, when dreams are most vivid, when the world seems most removed from the concerns of waking life. Thomas felt the weight of this hour, its particular quality of stillness and peace. His satchel was much lighter now. Perhaps a dozen deliveries left, maybe fewer. The end of his round was approaching, though there was still distance to cover, still letters to deliver, still streets to walk through the quiet darkness. He delivered to the final houses on Riverside Road, numbers 20, 24, and 28, then turned left onto Maple Drive, leaving the sound of the stream behind. Maple Drive rose gently away from the stream, climbing back toward the higher ground where most of the town was built. The road was newer than Riverside Road, paved smoothly and lined with trees that gave it its name, maples that in autumn would turn brilliant shades of red and gold, though now they stood bare against the night sky, their branches creating delicate patterns overhead. The houses here were post-war, built in the 1950s perhaps, simple and practical in their design. Semi-detached pairs mostly, with small front gardens and driveways leading to single garages. They lacked the grandeur of the Victorian villas or the charm of the older cottages, but they had their own appeal, honest, straightforward, built for families and everyday living rather than for show. Thomas appreciated this variety in the town's architecture, the way different eras had left their mark, each period building according to its own needs and values and available resources. Walking through the town at night, he passed through these different layers of time, seeing them all as part of a continuous whole rather than as separate or competing elements. Number 7 Maple Drive, a letter and a package, both for the same recipient. The package was soft, perhaps clothing or fabric of some kind. Thomas maneuvered it carefully through the letterbox, making sure it didn't catch or tear. Number 11, 2 letters, one official-looking, one personal. The letterbox here was slightly stiff, requiring a firm push to open. Thomas made a mental note of this, as he always did with difficult letterboxes, though he never did anything with these mental notes. They simply accumulated, part of his knowledge of the route, his familiarity with each house's particular characteristics. The climb continued steadily. Thomas's breathing deepened slightly with the effort, his legs working against the gradient. But the slope was manageable, nothing that required him to slow his pace or pause for rest. He'd climbed this section of road thousands of times over the years, and his body knew exactly what was required. At number 15, a security light activated as Thomas approached, flooding the front garden with harsh white light. He paused, momentarily dazzled, waiting for his eyes to adjust. The light had been triggered by a motion sensor, detecting his movement. He didn't mind, it was simply a feature of the modern world, people taking precautions, wanting to see who approached their homes even at night. The light illuminated the garden clearly, a neat lawn, a few shrubs trimmed into rounded shapes, a concrete path leading to the front door. Everything looked ordinary and unthreatening in the bright light, stripped of the mystery that darkness lent it. Thomas delivered the single letter quickly and moved away. Behind him, the light stayed on for perhaps 30 seconds more, then clicked off, returning the garden to darkness. The contrast made the night seem darker for a moment, until his eyes readjusted to the gentler glow of the street lamps. Number 19, 3 letters and a catalog. Number 23, a single postcard, showing mountains and a lake reflecting the sky. Number 27, 2 letters, both in the same handwriting, both addressed to different people at the same house. The rhythm of delivery continued, steady and unchanging. Thomas found comfort in this rhythm, in the way each action followed naturally from the one before, in the predictability and order of it all. His work wasn't exciting or dramatic or particularly interesting to others, but it had its own satisfaction. The satisfaction of routine performed well, of duties completed thoroughly, of small services rendered night after night without fanfare or recognition. Maple Drive ended at a small roundabout where 4 roads met. Thomas took the second exit, turning onto Orchard Lane. Despite its name, there were no orchards here now, though perhaps there had been once, years ago before the town expanded and houses were built on land that had previously grown fruit trees. Orchard Lane was older than Maple Drive, the houses more varied in style and age. Some were Victorian, some Edwardian, some from between the wars, all mixed together in no particular pattern. Gardens here were larger, more established, full of mature trees and shrubs that created shadows within shadows as Thomas passed. The street lamps were spaced farther apart on Orchard Lane, creating longer intervals of darkness between the pools of light. Thomas walked through these intervals without concern, his feet finding the pavement by habit, his eyes adjusted sufficiently to make out the basic shapes and boundaries of his path. Number 4 Orchard Lane, a substantial Victorian house with a turret at one corner and decorative brickwork around the windows. 2 letters tonight, both official-looking. The letterbox was brass, ornate, with a pull-down flap rather than the more common push-through style. Thomas opened it carefully, placed the letters inside, and let it close with a soft click. At number 8, the front garden had been allowed to grow wild. Not neglected exactly, but deliberately left to its own devices, creating a small wilderness of long grass and self-seeded flowers and bushes that spread where they pleased. Thomas rather liked this approach. There was something honest about it, an acceptance of nature's preferences rather than constant insistence on human control. 1 letter here, thin, handwritten. It disappeared into the letterbox and was gone. Number 12 was dark like all the others, but as Thomas approached he noticed a cat sitting on the windowsill inside, visible through a gap in the curtains. The cat was watching him, its eyes catching the streetlight and reflecting it back in that distinctive feline way. Thomas paused, meeting the cat's gaze for a moment. The cat blinked slowly, that same gesture of acknowledgement he'd seen from the cat on the gatepost earlier. 2 cats in one night, both offering that slow blink. Thomas found this oddly pleasing, as if the cats were the town's true nighttime residents, and he was the visitor in their domain, granted temporary acceptance through those measured blinks. He delivered the letters, 3 of them, and moved on, leaving the cat to its window watching. The night was beginning to change now, though the change was subtle, almost imperceptible. The quality of darkness was shifting, becoming perhaps fractionally less dense, as if the night was beginning its long, slow transition toward morning. Not that dawn was near, it was still hours away. But the deepest darkness had passed, that point of maximum night, and now the cycle was turning, infinitesimally slowly, back toward light. Thomas had learned to sense these changes over years of night work. He couldn't have explained exactly what he noticed, perhaps something in the air, or the way the sky looked between the stars, or simply an internal clock that had been calibrated by countless midnight rounds. But he knew, without checking his watch, that it was somewhere around 2:30 now, maybe 2:45. The night had entered that stretch where time seemed to slow even further, where minutes expanded and the hours between now and dawn felt vast and unhurried. Thomas liked this time. There was no pressure, no sense of morning approaching too quickly. Just the continued darkness and quiet, and his route unwinding before him at its steady pace. Number 16 Orchard Lane, a package too large for the letterbox. Thomas walked around to the side of the house where a porch had been built, and left the package there, tucked safely out of any weather. He'd done this many times before for this address. The occupants would know to look there. Number 20, 2 letters and a magazine. The letterbox here had a squeaky hinge that made a small sound when opened. Thomas had heard that squeak hundreds of times, always the same pitch, always the same length. It was part of the character of this particular letterbox, as distinctive as a voice. Number 24, set back from the road, reached by a long front path that wound between flower beds. In summer those beds would be full of color. Thomas remembered them from warm evening rounds when daylight still lingered past his usual hours. Now they were bare, mulched for winter, waiting for spring's warmth. 1 letter tonight, official looking. It slid through the letterbox and disappeared into the darkness of the house beyond. Orchard Lane curved to the left, following the contour of the land. The houses on the right side backed onto the park now, their back gardens separated from the park's expanse by walls or fences. Through gaps between houses, Thomas could see the park's darkness, deeper and more extensive than the darkness of streets and gardens, a darkness that spoke of open space and distance. He delivered to several more houses along this stretch, numbers 28, 32, 36. Each delivery the same in form, different only in the specific letters or packages involved. Each letterbox opening and closing, each house receiving what had been sent to it. At number 40, a fox trotted across the road ahead of him, moving with that distinctive gait foxes have, quick and fluid, and somehow both purposeful and casual at once. The fox didn't look at Thomas, didn't acknowledge his presence, just crossed from one side to the other and disappeared into a garden, leaving only the brief impression of russet fur and a bushy tail. Thomas smiled slightly. He saw foxes often on his rounds. They were common in the town, having adapted well to urban life, finding food in gardens and bins, making dens in quiet corners where people rarely went. They were beautiful creatures, wild things living alongside human habitation, part of the town's nighttime ecosystem. The road straightened again, running now toward the junction with Church Street. Thomas could see the church itself from here, its tower rising dark against the sky, its clock face glowing softly. The clock showed 10 minutes to 3. Time continuing its steady progression, minutes accumulating into hours, hours marking the night's slow passage. He delivered to the last few houses on Orchard Lane, numbers 44, 48, and 52, then turned right onto Church Street. The church stood on his left now, behind its low wall and iron railings, its grounds dark and quiet, its headstones standing in silent rows. Thomas had been in the churchyard during daylight, had read some of the inscriptions on the older stones, learning fragments of the town's history from the names and dates carved into granite and marble. Some stones dated back 200 years or more, their lettering worn almost smooth by weather and time, the people they commemorated long forgotten except by these silent markers. But at night, the churchyard was simply another dark space, peaceful and unremarkable. The dead rested there as they always did, beyond disturbance, beyond concern, their stories complete and settled into the past where they belonged. Thomas walked past the church, his footsteps echoing slightly off its stone walls. At the far end of Church Street, the high street began again, and beyond that lay his final few deliveries, the last handful of letters and packages that would complete his round and bring him back to the post office where he'd started hours ago. His satchel was very light now, perhaps 6 or 7 deliveries remaining. The weight of all those letters and packages, distributed house by house across the town, had been transferred from his shoulder to dozens of letterboxes and doorsteps, waiting now for morning when they would be collected and opened and read. The night's work was nearly done. The town had nearly received all that had been sent to it, and Thomas walked on through the quiet streets, carrying the last pieces of the night's mail toward their destinations, his pace unchanged, his rhythm unbroken, moving steadily toward completion. Church Street met the High Street at the War Memorial, a simple stone cross standing in a small paved area, surrounded by a low chain fence. The memorial bore names engraved in neat rows, men from the town who had died in 2 world wars, their sacrifice marked and remembered. Fresh poppy wreaths still lay at its base, left from the remembrance service held a few weeks earlier, their red petals fading now but still visible in the streetlight's glow. Thomas paused at the memorial, as he often did, not from any particular sense of duty or solemnity, but simply because it marked a transition point in his route, the shift from the residential streets to the High Street, the beginning of the final stretch of his round. The High Street was quiet, as it had been when he'd walked through it earlier. The shops stood dark and shuttered, their displays waiting patiently for tomorrow's customers. The street itself was empty, no cars, no movement, nothing but the street lamps casting their steady light onto the pavement. Thomas turned right, walking back along the High Street, but on the opposite side from before. He had a few more deliveries in the flats above the shops, addresses he hadn't reached during his first pass through this area. The clock tower stood ahead of him, its face showing just past 3 now. 3 o'clock in the morning, that particular hour that felt more like night's property than morning's, despite being technically part of the new day. The darkness still held complete dominion. Dawn was still hours away, not even a suggestion yet on the eastern horizon. Number 27 High Street, a flat above what was during the day a florist's shop. Thomas found the side door that led to the upstairs flats, pushed it open quietly, and climbed the narrow stairs. The stairwell smelled of flowers faintly, the scent drifting up from the shop below, even though the shop had been closed for hours. The letterbox for Flat B was mounted on the wall at the top of the stairs. 2 letters tonight, both personal by the look of them. Thomas delivered them and descended the stairs again, his footsteps soft on the worn carpet runner. Back on the street, he continued along the high street. The shops here were familiar to him in their daytime incarnations. The bakery where he sometimes bought bread on his way home, the newsagent where he'd occasionally stop for a paper, the small cafe with its outdoor tables that in warmer weather were always occupied by people watching the world pass by. But at night they were transformed, emptied of their daily purposes, reduced to their architectural essentials, doors and windows and walls, shapes and shadows, buildings waiting to become shops again when morning came and brought back the activity that defined them. Number 33, another flat, this one above a charity shop. 1 letter, official looking. Thomas navigated the familiar doorway and stairs, delivered the letter, and returned to the street. At number 37, above what had been a tea shop for 40 years, and still had the original painted sign on its window, he delivered a small package and 2 letters. The stairwell here was particularly narrow, and Thomas had to turn sideways in places to carry his satchel up without bumping the walls. The work continued in its steady rhythm. Each building entered, each stairwell climbed, each letterbox receiving its contents. Nothing rushed, nothing overlooked. The same care for the last deliveries as for the first, the same attention to doing the work properly regardless of how many times he'd done it before. When he emerged from the last building, Thomas stood for a moment on the pavement, letting his breathing return to its normal pace after the stairs. The night air felt good after the closed-in feeling of the stairwells, fresh and clean and open. He checked his list. For deliveries remaining, all on the streets that ran off the high street toward the east, small residential roads he'd bypassed earlier in favor of completing the larger routes first. Thomas turned left onto Chapel Lane, a short street of terraced houses that ran behind the high street. The houses here were small and old, workers' cottages perhaps from when the town was smaller, and most people worked in the mills that had once stood by the river. The mills were long gone now, converted to apartments or demolished entirely, but the cottages remained, their small scale and simple design a reminder of an earlier, more modest era. Number 5 Chapel Lane, 2 letters, both handwritten. The letterbox was low, set into the bottom of the door, and Thomas crouched to reach it. His knees protested more noticeably now, not painfully exactly, but with a definite stiffness that spoke of age and hours of walking and the lateness of the hour. He delivered the letters, straightened slowly, and moved on to number 9. The cottages sat directly on the pavement, their front doors opening straight onto the street with no space between. It gave the lane an intimate, enclosed feeling, as if the houses were leaning in toward each other, creating a shared space that was neither quite public nor quite private. At number 13, someone had planted flowers in window boxes, pansies that even in the dim light showed their bright faces, yellow and purple and white. They were the only flowers Thomas had seen blooming at this time of year, hardy and cheerful and defying the approaching winter. 1 letter here, thin and official. It whispered through the letterbox and was gone. Chapel Lane ended at a T-junction with Prospect Street. Thomas turned right, walking toward the final 2 addresses on his list. Prospect Street was slightly wider than Chapel Lane, with a pavement on one side though not the other, and houses that were a bit larger, probably built a generation or 2 later than the Chapel Lane cottages. Trees grew along the street, not in any formal arrangement, just wherever someone had planted them years ago, and they'd survived. An oak here, a rowan there, a cherry tree that in spring would be covered in white blossoms. Now they stood bare, their branches creating patterns against the sky, their roots cracking the pavement in places where they'd grown too large for the space allowed them. Number 14 Prospect Street, a letter and a small package. The house was dark and quiet like all the others, giving no indication of who lived there or what their life was like. Just a door, windows, walls. A private space that Thomas touched only at its edge, delivering mail but never entering, never knowing anything beyond the address and the regularity of what arrived. He delivered the items and walked on to the final address. Number 22 Prospect Street, the last delivery of the night. A single letter, handwritten, postmarked locally. Thomas held it for a moment before delivering it, acknowledging in some quiet way that this was the last one, that his round was nearly complete, that in a few minutes he'd be walking back to the post office with an empty satchel. The letterbox opened smoothly. The letter slid through and landed with a soft sound on what was probably a doormat. The letterbox closed with a quiet click. Done. Thomas stood on the pavement, his satchel empty now, all the letters and packages delivered. Every address on his list completed. Every item of mail placed safely into its designated letterbox, waiting there for morning when it would be collected and opened and become part of someone's day. The night stretched around him, quiet and complete. The street lamps glowed steadily. Somewhere a cat called, then fell silent. The distant sound of water moving in pipes reached him from somewhere, probably the water treatment plant at the edge of town, always running, always processing. Thomas took a slow breath, letting the completion settle into him. His round was finished. The night's work was done. All that remained was the walk back to the post office, the return journey through empty streets to the place where he'd started hours ago. He began walking, retracing his route in reverse now, his footsteps carrying him back toward the high street and the turning that would take him to Elm Street and the post office. The town continued its sleeping. The houses remained dark and quiet. Nothing had changed. The delivery of mail was such a small thing, such a quiet service, that it left no visible mark on the night. Yet every house he'd visited now held something it hadn't held before, some piece of communication or commerce or connection that had been carried through the darkness to arrive at its proper destination. Thomas found satisfaction in this invisible work, this service rendered without witness or acknowledgement. The letters would be found in the morning, opened, read, responded to perhaps, and the cycle would continue, day after day, night after night, the postal system functioning exactly as it should, connecting people and places through the simple, reliable medium of paper and envelope and delivery. The high street opened before him, familiar and unchanged. The clock tower showed 3:15. Thomas walked down the center of the street, his shadow appearing and disappearing beneath the street lamps, his pace steady, his breathing calm. At the far end of the high street, he turned left onto Elm Street. The post office stood halfway down, its single light still burning in the back room where he'd started his preparations hours ago. The light looked warm and welcoming now, promising rest after work, quiet after walking, stillness after motion. But Thomas didn't hurry toward it. He maintained his steady pace, letting the night's rhythm carry him those final yards, not rushing the completion, not racing toward the end. He reached the post office and paused at the door, looking back down the empty street. The town slept on, unaware of his return, unaware of the round completed, the letters delivered, the night's work done. Thomas turned the key in the lock and stepped inside, the door closing quietly behind him. The back room was exactly as he'd left it, the sorting table, the empty pigeonholes, the hooks where coats hung, the small sink in the corner. He removed his satchel and hung it on its designated hook. The leather was shaped to his shoulder after years of carrying, worn smooth in places, marked with the honest signs of use and time. Church Street met the High Street at the War Memorial, a simple stone cross standing in a small paved area, surrounded by a low chain fence. The memorial bore names engraved in neat rows, men from the town who had died in 2 world wars, their sacrifice marked and remembered. Fresh poppy wreaths still lay at its base, left from the remembrance service held a few weeks earlier, their red petals fading now, but still visible in the streetlight's glow. Thomas paused at the memorial, as he often did, not from any particular sense of duty or solemnity, but simply because it marked a transition point in his route, the shift from the residential streets to the high street, the beginning of the final stretch of his round. The high street was quiet, as it had been when he'd walked through it earlier. The shops stood dark and shuttered, their displays waiting patiently for tomorrow's customers. The street itself was empty, no cars, no movement, nothing but the street lamps casting their steady light onto the pavement. Thomas turned right, walking back along the high street, but on the opposite side from before. He had a few more deliveries in the flats above the shops, addresses he hadn't reached during his first pass through this area. The clock tower stood ahead of him, its face showing just past 3 now. 3 o'clock in the morning, that particular hour that felt more like night's property than morning's, despite being technically part of the new day. The darkness still held complete dominion. Dawn was still hours away, not even a suggestion yet on the eastern horizon. Number 27 High Street, a flat above what was during the day a florist's shop. Thomas found the side door that led to the upstairs flats, pushed it open quietly, and climbed the narrow stairs. The stairwell smelled of flowers faintly, the scent drifting up from the shop below, even though the shop had been closed for hours. The letterbox for flat B was mounted on the wall at the top of the stairs. 2 letters tonight, both personal by the look of them. Thomas delivered them and descended the stairs again, his footsteps soft on the worn carpet runner. Back on the street, he continued along the high street. The shops here were familiar to him in their daytime incarnations. The bakery where he sometimes bought bread on his way home, the newsagent where he'd occasionally stop for a paper, the small cafe with its outdoor tables that in warmer weather were always occupied by people watching the world pass by. But at night they were transformed, emptied of their daily purposes, reduced to their architectural essentials, doors and windows and walls, shapes and shadows, buildings waiting to become shops again when morning came and brought back the activity that defined them. Number 33, another flat, this one above a charity shop. One letter, official looking. Thomas navigated the familiar doorway and stairs, delivered the letter, and returned to the street. At number 37, above what had been a tea shop for 40 years, and still had the original painted sign on its window, he delivered a small package and 2 letters. The stairwell here was particularly narrow, and Thomas had to turn sideways in places to carry his satchel up without bumping the walls. The work continued in its steady rhythm. Each building entered, each stairwell climbed, each letterbox receiving its contents. Nothing rushed, nothing overlooked. The same care for the last deliveries as for the first, the same attention to doing the work properly regardless of how many times he'd done it before. When he emerged from the last building, Thomas stood for a moment on the pavement, letting his breathing return to its normal pace after the stairs. The night air felt good after the closed-in feeling of the stairwells, fresh and clean and open. He checked his list. For deliveries remaining, all on the streets that ran off the high street toward the east, small residential roads he'd bypassed earlier in favor of completing the larger routes first. Thomas turned left onto Chapel Lane, a short street of terraced houses that ran behind the high street. The houses here were small and old, workers' cottages perhaps from when the town was smaller, and most people worked in the mills that had once stood by the river. The mills were long gone now, converted to apartments or demolished entirely, but the cottages remained, their small scale and simple design a reminder of an earlier, more modest era. Number 5 Chapel Lane, 2 letters, both handwritten. The letterbox was low, set into the bottom of the door, and Thomas crouched to reach it. His knees protested more noticeably now, not painfully exactly, but with a definite stiffness that spoke of age and hours of walking and the lateness of the hour. He delivered the letters, straightened slowly, and moved on to number 9. The cottages sat directly on the pavement, their front doors opening straight onto the street with no space between. It gave the lane an intimate, enclosed feeling, as if the houses were leaning in toward each other, creating a shared space that was neither quite public nor quite private. At number 13, someone had planted flowers in window boxes, pansies that even in the dim light showed their bright faces, yellow and purple and white. They were the only flowers Thomas had seen blooming at this time of year, hardy and cheerful, and defying the approaching winter. One letter here, thin and official. It whispered through the letterbox, and was gone. Chapel Lane ended at a T-junction with Prospect Street. Thomas turned right, walking toward the final 2 addresses on his list. Prospect Street was slightly wider than Chapel Lane, with a pavement on one side though not the other, and houses that were a bit larger, probably built a generation or 2 later than the Chapel Lane cottages. Trees grew along the street, not in any formal arrangement, just wherever someone had planted them years ago, and they'd survived. An oak here, a rowan there, a cherry tree that in spring would be covered in white blossoms. Now they stood bare, their branches creating patterns against the sky, their roots cracking the pavement in places where they'd grown too large for the space allowed them. Number 14 Prospect Street, a letter and a small package. The house was dark and quiet like all the others, giving no indication of who lived there or what their life was like. Just a door, windows, walls. A private space that Thomas touched only at its edge, delivering mail but never entering, never knowing anything beyond the address and the regularity of what arrived. He delivered the items and walked on to the final address. Number 22 Prospect Street, the last delivery of the night. A single letter, handwritten, postmarked locally. Thomas held it for a moment before delivering it, acknowledging in some quiet way that this was the last one, that his round was nearly complete, that in a few minutes he'd be walking back to the post office with an empty satchel. The letterbox opened smoothly. The letter slid through and landed with a soft sound on what was probably a doormat. The letterbox closed with a quiet click. Done. Thomas stood on the pavement, his satchel empty now, all the letters and packages delivered. Every address on his list completed. Every item of mail placed safely into its designated letterbox, waiting there for morning when it would be collected and opened and become part of someone's day. The night stretched around him, quiet and complete. The street lamps glowed steadily. Somewhere a cat called, then fell silent. The distant sound of water moving in pipes reached him from somewhere, probably the water treatment plant at the edge of town, always running, always processing. Thomas took a slow breath, letting the completion settle into him. His round was finished. The night's work was done. All that remained was the walk back to the post office, the return journey through empty streets to the place where he'd started hours ago. He began walking, retracing his route in reverse now, his footsteps carrying him back toward the high street and the turning that would take him to Elm Street and the post office. The town continued its sleeping. The houses remained dark and quiet. Nothing had changed. The delivery of mail was such a small thing, such a quiet service, that it left no visible mark on the night. Yet every house he'd visited now held something it hadn't held before, some piece of communication or commerce or connection that had been carried through the darkness to arrive at its proper destination. Thomas found satisfaction in this invisible work, this service rendered without witness or acknowledgement. The letters would be found in the morning, opened, read, responded to perhaps, and the cycle would continue, day after day, night after night, the postal system functioning exactly as it should, connecting people and places through the simple, reliable medium of paper and envelope and delivery. The high street opened before him, familiar and unchanged. The clock tower showed 3:15. Thomas walked down the center of the street, his shadow appearing and disappearing beneath the street lamps, his pace steady, his breathing calm. At the far end of the high street, he turned left onto Elm Street. The post office stood halfway down, its single light still burning in the back room where he'd started his preparations hours ago. The light looked warm and welcoming now, promising rest after work, quiet after walking, stillness after motion. But Thomas didn't hurry toward it. He maintained his steady pace, letting the night's rhythm carry him those final yards, not rushing the completion, not racing toward the end. He reached the post office and paused at the door, looking back down the empty street. The town slept on, unaware of his return, unaware of the round completed, the letters delivered, the night's work done. Thomas turned the key in the lock and stepped inside, the door closing quietly behind him. The back room was exactly as he'd left it, the sorting table, the empty pigeonholes, the hooks where coats hung, the small sink in the corner. He removed his satchel and hung it on its designated hook. The leather was shaped to his shoulder after years of carrying, worn smooth in places, marked with the honest signs of use and time. Thomas moved through the back room with the same deliberate calm he'd maintained throughout the night. There was still work to be done before his round was truly complete. Small tasks of closing and recording, the administrative details that bookend the physical work of delivery. He filled out the completion sheet, noting the time of his return, the number of items delivered, any issues encountered. There had been no issues tonight. Every letterbox had opened, every address had been accessible, every item had been delivered exactly as it should be. He wrote, "All completed satisfactorily," in the comments section, his handwriting neat and practiced from years of filling out these same forms. The clock on the wall showed 3:25. A standard time for completion, not particularly fast, not particularly slow, just consistent with what was expected and what Thomas always achieved. Consistency was something he valued, a sign that the work was being done properly, that he was maintaining the standards he'd set for himself. He filed the completion sheet in the appropriate folder, making sure it was properly positioned, the edge aligned with the others beneath it. Small details, but details mattered. They were part of treating the work with respect, part of maintaining order and precision. The kettle stood on the small counter in the corner, and Thomas filled it from the tap, the water running clear and cold. He switched it on and stood listening to it begin to heat, the element clicking and humming quietly. While he waited, he washed his hands at the sink, the water cold on his skin, feeling good after hours of handling envelopes and opening letterboxes. The kettle reached its boil and clicked off. Thomas made tea, just a simple mug of black tea, nothing elaborate, and carried it to the small wooden chair that sat beside the sorting table. He lowered himself into it carefully, feeling his legs grateful for the rest, feeling the accumulated tiredness of the night's walking settle into his muscles. The tea was hot and strong, exactly what he wanted. He drank it slowly, letting the warmth spread through him, letting his body relax into the chair and the stillness. No need to move now. No more walking required. Just this quiet space and the hot tea and the gentle satisfaction of work completed. The back room was peaceful. The light from the single bulb was warm rather than bright, creating a small circle of illumination that left the corners in gentle shadow. The walls were lined with shelves and cubby holes, all empty now, waiting for tomorrow's deliveries to arrive and begin the cycle again. Thomas thought about the route he'd just completed, not in any analytical way, not reviewing or critiquing, just letting the memory of it pass through his mind. The quiet streets, the sleeping houses, the rhythm of walking and delivering, the cats he'd seen, the fox crossing the road, the sound of the stream flowing in darkness, the stars bright and steady overhead. It had been a good round, like most of his rounds. No drama, no problems, just steady work done steadily well. There was deep satisfaction in that, in the simple completion of duty, in the reliable performance of necessary work. He finished his tea and rinsed the mug in the sink, setting it on the draining board to dry. Then he removed his uniform jacket and hung it carefully on its hook. Beneath it he wore a simple shirt, slightly damp now with the accumulated sweat of hours of walking, but not uncomfortable. The back room had a small toilet in the corner, separated by a wooden partition. Thomas used it, washed his hands again, and returned to the main space. He was tired now in a good way, the tiredness that comes from physical work done well, from hours of activity that have used the body as it was meant to be used. He checked that everything was in order, the door locked, the lights that needed to be off turned off, the lights that needed to stay on left burning. The post office had its routines for opening and closing, and Thomas followed them precisely, just as he followed every other routine precisely. His own coat hung by the back door, a dark wool coat that he'd owned for years. He put it on, feeling its familiar weight settle onto his shoulders, different from the weight of his satchel but equally familiar. From the pocket he withdrew a flat cap, also well-worn, shaped to his head. He stood for a moment in the back room, looking around at the space where he'd worked for so many years. The sorting table, the shelves, the hooks and cubby holes, the clock on the wall. Everything in its place, everything as it should be. Then he turned off the main light, leaving only the small lamp burning, the one that always stayed on, marking the post office's presence even in the hours when it was closed. He stepped out through the back door into the small yard behind the building, locked the door behind him, and tested it to make sure it was secure. The night air was cooler now, definitely cooler than it had been when he'd started his round. Thomas could feel the change clearly, that shift that came in the hours before dawn when temperature dropped to its lowest point. His breath was visible now, small clouds that formed and dissipated with each exhalation. The yard was small and functional, a space for bins and storage, nothing more. A gate at the back led to an alley that ran behind the shops on Elm Street. Thomas walked through the gate, closing it carefully behind him, and turned down the alley toward the street. His footsteps echoed slightly between the walls of the buildings on either side, a different sound than his footsteps on the open streets had made during his round. More enclosed, more reverberant. The alley was darker too, with no street lamps, just the ambient light that filtered in from the street ahead. He emerged onto Elm Street and paused, looking left and right. The street was as empty as it had been when he'd walked through it earlier. The shops still shuttered, the street lamps still glowing. Nothing changed, nothing different. Thomas turned right, walking toward the small flat where he lived, above the butcher's shop 3 doors down from the post office. It was convenient, this proximity between work and home, just a few minutes' walk, hardly any distance at all. He'd lived there for 15 years now, ever since his wife had passed, and he'd decided the house they'd shared was too large for one person alone. The flat was small but sufficient, a living room, a bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom. Enough space for his needs, which were modest. Books lined the shelves in the living room. A comfortable chair sat by the window. A small television that he rarely watched. Everything tidy and ordered, reflecting the same care he brought to his work. The side door that led to the flat was between the butcher's shop and the bakery next door. Thomas unlocked it and climbed the stairs, his legs protesting now more noticeably than they had during his round. Going upstairs was harder than walking on level ground, and these stairs were steep and narrow, built in an era when space was at a premium and comfort less considered. He reached the landing and unlocked the flat's door, stepping into the small hallway. The flat was dark and quiet, exactly as he'd left it hours ago when he'd departed for work. He closed the door behind him, turning the lock, and stood for a moment letting the stillness of the space settle around him. Home. The end of the night's journey. The place where he could finally stop moving, finally rest. Thomas removed his coat and cap, hanging them on the hook beside the door. He removed his shoes, lining them up neatly beneath the coat. Then he walked through to the kitchen and filled a glass with water from the tap, drinking it slowly, feeling the coolness slide down his throat. The kitchen window looked out over the backyards and gardens of the neighboring buildings. Everything was dark out there, though he could see a light in one window several houses away. Someone else awake in the night, for whatever reason. An insomniac perhaps, or a shift worker like himself, or someone with a sick child, or simply someone who preferred the night hours to the day. Thomas finished the water and set the glass in the sink. He felt the tiredness more strongly now, that good exhaustion that made bed seem like the most desirable place in the world. But he didn't rush toward it. He moved through his evening routine, checking that the windows were closed, that the door was locked, that everything was as it should be. In the bathroom he washed his face, brushed his teeth, completed the small rituals of preparing for sleep. The mirror showed him his own face, older now than it had been when he'd started this work, lined and weathered by time and weather, but still recognizably his. Still the face he'd always had, just marked by the years, shaped by experience. He changed into pajamas, simple cotton ones, comfortable and practical. Then he walked through to the bedroom, where the curtains were already drawn and the bed waited, covers turned back from this morning when he'd risen. The bed looked inviting, pillows plump, sheets clean, blankets sufficient. Thomas lowered himself onto the edge of the mattress, feeling it give slightly beneath his weight. He sat there for a moment, his hands resting on his knees, letting the final transition happen, from worker to sleeper, from activity to rest. Outside, the town continued its sleeping. The street lamps glowed. The church clock struck the half hour, 3:30 now. The night was moving toward its end, though dawn was still hours away, still just a future possibility rather than an approaching reality. Thomas lifted his legs onto the bed, settled back against the pillows, and pulled the covers up. The bed was comfortable, familiar, exactly the right softness and support after hours of walking. He reached over and turned off the bedside lamp, and darkness filled the room, complete and peaceful. He lay there in the darkness, feeling his body relax more deeply, feeling the tiredness spread through his muscles like warmth. His round was complete. His work was done. The letters had been delivered. The town had been served. And now he could rest, could let go of consciousness, could drift into sleep. His breathing slowed and deepened. His thoughts began to blur and drift. The day, or rather the night, released its hold on him, and he released his hold on it in turn. Tomorrow evening he would wake and begin again. The cycle would continue. But that was tomorrow's concern. For now there was only this, the comfortable bed, the warm darkness, the deep and restful peace of work completed and rest earned. Thomas's eyes closed. His breathing settled into the rhythm of sleep. And in the quiet flat above the butcher's shop, one more person joined the town's collective rest, surrendering to sleep as the night moved on through its final hours toward morning. The darkness behind Thomas's closed eyes was complete and restful, a darkness that held no images yet, no dreams, just the peaceful emptiness that comes in those first moments of falling asleep. His body had finally stopped moving after hours of walking, and the stillness felt profound, a contrast so complete it was almost tangible. His breathing continued its slow, steady rhythm, in and out, each breath deeper than the last, each exhalation releasing a little more of the accumulated tension from the night's work. His muscles were relaxing now, that gradual process of letting go that moves from the surface deeper and deeper into the body, releasing held patterns of effort and activity. The bed cradled him, its familiar support exactly what his tired body needed. The pillow beneath his head was soft and cool. The blankets over him held warmth without weight, covering without pressing. Everything was arranged for comfort, for rest, for the deep sleep that the night's work had earned him. In the darkness of the room, time seemed to slow even further than it had during the deepest hours of the night. Minutes stretched and expanded. The distinction between moments blurred. There was only now, this continuing present of darkness and quiet and gradual descent into sleep. Outside the window, beyond the drawn curtains, the town continued its sleeping. The houses stood in their rows, dark and quiet, their occupants lost in their own dreams, their own private worlds of rest and restoration. Some slept deeply, others more lightly. Some dreamed vivid, memorable dreams, while others drifted through formless sleep without images or stories. The streets remained empty. The street lamps still burned, marking the hours with their patient light, asking nothing, simply being what they were, sources of illumination in the darkness, guides for any who might need to find their way. In the park, the trees stood in their silent gathering, their branches moving very slightly when the occasional breeze found them, then falling still again. The grass stretched away in the darkness, damp now with forming dew, the moisture gathering on each blade, catching the starlight in tiny gleaming points too small to see individually, but together creating a subtle sheen across the ground. The stream continued its flow, water moving over stones, following the path that had worn into the earth over thousands of years, patient and persistent and eternal. The sound it made was constant, a soft murmur that belonged entirely to the night, heard by no one now but continuing regardless, needing no audience for its song. Thomas's thoughts had faded almost completely now, leaving only the barest flickers of consciousness, small sparks that appeared and disappeared like fireflies in darkness. A memory of the fox crossing the road, there and gone. The image of a letterbox opening, present then absent. The feeling of walking beneath trees, felt then released. Nothing held. Nothing insisted on attention. Each thought arose naturally and dissolved naturally, like breath itself, coming and going without effort or control. His heartbeat had slowed to its resting rate, steady and sure, that fundamental rhythm that had beat continuously since before his birth and would continue until his life's end, counting out his time in quiet pulses, unconcerned with anything but its own persistent rhythm. In the flat, the silence was complete. No sounds from outside penetrated the walls and windows. No sounds from within disturbed the stillness. Just the profound quiet of a space at rest, empty of activity, devoted entirely to the simple purpose of providing shelter and peace. The darkness seemed to have depth, as if it were something that could be entered, descended into like water or air. Thomas was sinking into it slowly, his consciousness dimming by degrees so gradual that there was no single moment of transition from waking to sleeping, just this continuous gentle descent, this slow dissolving of awareness. Time passed, whether minutes or longer, it was impossible to say. In sleep, time loses its usual measures. It becomes elastic, subjective, unmeasured by clocks or watches. An hour might feel like minutes, or minutes might stretch toward hours. The usual rules no longer apply. Thomas's breathing had become so quiet now that it was barely perceptible, just the slightest movement of his chest rising and falling, synchronized with the ancient rhythm of breath that all living things share. Somewhere in the town, a church clock struck the hour, for measured chimes carrying through the still air, marking 4 o'clock in the morning. The deepest hour of night had passed now, though darkness still held complete dominion, and would for hours yet. The sound of the chimes reached Thomas's flat, muffled by walls and distance but present nonetheless, for notes rising and fading, then silence returning more completely than before, as if the chimes had somehow deepened the quiet by their brief interruption of it. Thomas didn't wake. The sound registered somewhere in his sleeping mind, noted and dismissed, too familiar to cause concern or interest. The church clock marked every hour, and he'd heard it thousands of times, waking and sleeping. It was simply part of the town's soundscape, as natural and unremarkable as birdsong or wind. His sleep was deepening now, moving past that transitional stage between waking and sleeping into the realm of true rest. His mind was beginning to dream, though the dreams were formless yet, just sensations and impressions rather than narratives or images. A sense of walking, though not actual walking, just the feeling of forward motion, of progress through space. A sense of completion, of tasks finished, of work done well. A sense of peace, deep and abiding, requiring no justification or explanation, simply present like the darkness itself. The dreams would become more formed later, might develop into stories or scenarios or strange juxtapositions of memory and imagination. But for now they were just these gentle impressions, like watercolors left out in rain, their edges soft and undefined, their content more feeling than form. Thomas's face was relaxed completely now, all the small tensions released, all the minute muscular efforts of waking expression dissolved into the smoothness of sleep. His hands lay still on top of the blankets, no longer moving or gesturing, just resting, palms slightly curved, fingers loosely curled. In this deep rest, his body was doing its necessary work of restoration and repair. Cells were regenerating. Tissues were healing the tiny damages of use and age. Systems were rebalancing themselves. All the invisible processes that maintain life were proceeding in their complex orchestrations, needing no conscious direction, no oversight, just happening as they'd evolved to happen over millions of years. The bedroom window faced east, though this made no difference yet. The darkness outside was still complete, showing no hint of the dawn that would eventually come. The stars still shone in their ancient patterns. The moon, in its current phase, had already set, leaving the sky to the stars alone. Far beyond the town, beyond the fields and forests that surrounded it, beyond the river valley and the distant hills, the earth continued its slow turning. The night that covered this town was moving westward across the continent as the earth rotated toward the sun. To the east, hundreds of miles away, dawn was already breaking, light spreading across the landscape, waking birds and animals and people to a new day. But here, in this room, in this town, night still reigned. The darkness still held. And Thomas slept on, his rest deep and complete, his body and mind both surrendered to sleep's necessary work. The hours would pass. The night would continue its slow progression. Eventually dawn would come, bringing light and warmth and the stirring of the day's activity. People would wake. Houses would come alive with motion and sound. The town would remember its daytime self and resume its familiar patterns. But that was still hours away. For now there was only this, the deep night, the profound quiet, the sleeping town, and Thomas resting in his small flat, his night's work completed, his round finished, his duty done. His breathing continued its gentle rhythm, steady and slow. In and out, the most basic rhythm of life, continuing without thought or effort, automatic and eternal. The darkness cradled him. The silence held him. And sleep took him deeper, down into its restorative depths, away from consciousness and concern, into the peaceful realm where the body rests and the mind renews itself. In the street below, a cat walked past, its paws silent on the pavement. It paused to look up at the windows of the sleeping buildings, then continued on its way, following its own nighttime paths, pursuing its own feline purposes. The street lamps continued their patient burning. The stars wheeled slowly overhead. And the night moved on, marking time, holding space, waiting with infinite patience for the dawn that would eventually, inevitably come. But for now, for these hours yet remaining, the night was all. The darkness was complete. And Thomas slept on, deeply and peacefully, his rest earned by honest work, his sleep profound and healing. The night settled more deeply around the sleeping town, holding it in a stillness that felt almost protective, as if the darkness itself were watching over the houses and streets, keeping them safe while they rested. The air had grown cooler still, that final drop in temperature that comes in the hours before dawn, when warmth has drained away completely and the earth remembers winter. In the park, dew had formed more fully now, coating every surface with tiny droplets of moisture. The grass blades bent slightly under the weight of the dew, each one supporting its burden of water that caught and held whatever light found it. The benches were damp, their wooden slats dark with moisture. The paths gleamed faintly where the dew had settled on the packed earth and gravel. A hedgehog moved through the undergrowth at the park's edge, shuffling through fallen leaves, searching for insects and worms, following scent trails invisible to any other creature. Its small dark eyes reflected nothing. Its spines bristled at the slightest sound. But there were no sounds to disturb it, just the gentle rustle of its own movement and the distant murmur of the stream. The stream itself had taken on a different character in these deepest hours. The water seemed darker, more mysterious, as if it were flowing from somewhere unknowable toward an equally unknowable destination. But it was the same water, following the same course, moving at the same pace. Only the light had changed, and with it, the human perception of what the stream was and meant. In the residential streets, the houses stood in their various styles and sizes, each one a container of private lives, private dreams, private concerns. Behind each darkened window, people slept, some alone, some with partners, some with children in nearby rooms. Each person lost in their own interior world, their own necessary rest. Some were dreaming vivid dreams, chasing or being chased, flying or falling, encountering people long dead or never met, experiencing scenarios impossible in waking life, but absolutely convincing within the dream's own logic. Others drifted through formless sleep, their minds quiet, processing the day's experiences in ways that left no conscious memory. In one house on Chestnut Road, an elderly man woke briefly, disoriented, unsure of the time. He lay in the darkness, letting his eyes adjust, waiting for his mind to place him. Yes, his bedroom, his house, his life. The clock on the nightstand showed 4:15. Hours yet before morning. He closed his eyes again and let sleep reclaim him, sinking back into its embrace without resistance. In another house on Birch Avenue, a baby stirred in its cot but didn't wake, making small sounds in its sleep, mouth moving as if nursing though no bottle or breast was present. The mother, sleeping in the next room, didn't hear. She was deep in her own exhausted sleep, the sleep of someone who wakes frequently through the night and has learned to take rest wherever and whenever it's available. On Harper Lane, a cat jumped down from a bed where it had been sleeping and padded to the kitchen where its water bowl stood. It drank quietly, lap, 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 then returned to the bedroom and jumped back onto the bed, circling twice before settling into the warm spot it had left. The person in the bed didn't stir, didn't notice the cat's absence or return, just continued sleeping. These small movements, these minor disturbances to the night's complete stillness, they were part of the natural rhythm of sleeping hours. Not everyone slept continuously. Not everyone remained perfectly still. Life continued even in sleep, with its own needs and adjustments and small necessities. But Thomas slept on undisturbed, his rest deep and complete. His flat was quiet, sealed against the night's minor sounds and movements. Nothing penetrated to disturb him. Nothing required his attention or response. He had entered that profound stage of sleep where the body does its deepest work of restoration, where consciousness has descended as far as it can go while still maintaining the basic functions of life. His dreams, if he was having them, left no impression on his sleeping face. Whatever scenarios his sleeping mind was creating or processing, they played out in complete privacy, invisible to any observer, perhaps even inaccessible to his own waking memory when morning came. The flat around him was a study in stillness. Nothing moved. No clocks ticked. He'd removed the ticking clock years ago, finding its sound intrusive during sleep. The refrigerator in the kitchen hummed so quietly it was barely audible. No drafts stirred the curtains. Everything was calm, settled, at rest. In the living room, the books on their shelves stood silent, their spines showing titles and authors in the darkness, though there was no one to read them. Novels and histories, poetry and biography, books about nature and travel and the lives of others, all the accumulated reading of years, the slow building of a personal library. Thomas read most evenings before sleep, when his shift allowed. Not from any sense of duty or self-improvement, but simply for pleasure, for the quiet companionship of a good book, for the window it opened onto other lives and other ways of seeing the world. He read slowly, carefully, giving the words their full weight, never rushing through a book just to finish it. But tonight, or rather this morning, in these deep hours before dawn, there was no reading. Just sleep, profound and necessary, the body and mind both claiming their time for rest and recovery. Outside, the sky had begun its imperceptible shift. Not dawn yet. Dawn was still perhaps 2 hours away. But the absolute depth of night had passed. The darkness was fractionally less complete, though the change was too subtle to notice unless one had been watching the sky for hours, attuned to its smallest variations. The stars remained bright, undimmed by any approaching light. The constellations held their patterns, Orion standing clear in the southern sky now, the plow rotating slowly around the North Star, other patterns known and named by humans across millennia, seen and recognized from every culture and every age. Those same stars had shone down on the town when it was first built, and before that when the land was just fields and forest, and before that when ice covered everything, and before that when the land was warm and different creatures walked upon it. The stars were ancient beyond human comprehension, their light traveling for years or centuries or longer to reach this small planet, this particular town, these specific sleeping streets. Thomas knew this, in the abstract way that anyone who has read about astronomy knows it, but he didn't think about it often. The stars were simply there, beautiful and distant, requiring no particular response beyond appreciation. He liked seeing them on clear nights like this, liked the way they reminded him that the world was larger than the town, larger than any human concern. But now he slept, and the stars wheeled overhead without witness, continuing their ancient dance, unconcerned with observation or acknowledgement. In the post office on Elm Street, the small lamp still burned, its light visible through the window, a small beacon marking the building's presence even in the hours when it was closed and empty. The light served no practical purpose at this hour. No one needed to find the post office in the middle of the night. No one was seeking its services. But it burned nonetheless, following its programmed schedule, maintaining its vigil. The sorting table stood empty, its surface clear and clean, ready for tomorrow's work to begin. The pigeonholes on the wall waited vacant, their small compartments like empty rooms, like spaces holding their breath. Later today, much later, after dawn, after morning had fully established itself, the mail would arrive and the sorting would begin, and the pigeonholes would fill with letters and packages, each one destined for a specific route, a specific address. And then, when evening came again and most people were finishing their day's work, Thomas would wake and begin his preparations, checking his route, filling his satchel, setting out once more into the night to walk his round, to deliver the mail, to perform the quiet service that connected the town's residents to each other and to the wider world. But that cycle would begin again in its own time. For now, the post office rested, as Thomas rested, as the town rested. Everything in its proper time, everything following its natural rhythm. A fox appeared on Elm Street, trotting down the center of the road with that characteristic gait, purposeful but relaxed, alert but not anxious. It might have been the same fox Thomas had seen earlier, or a different one. The town had several foxes, all following their own territories and patterns. The fox paused at the post office, sniffing the air, then continued on, turning down a side street and disappearing into the shadows between buildings. Going where foxes go, doing what foxes do, part of the town's ecosystem, as much a resident as any human though living a completely different life, sleeping in different hours, eating different food, thinking whatever thoughts foxes think in their unknowable minds. The church clock struck the half hour, 4:30 now. The sound carried clearly through the still air, for chimes, and then a single deeper note marking the half hour. The sound rose and fell, then faded into silence, leaving the night quieter than before. In his bed, Thomas stirred very slightly, not waking, just adjusting position in his sleep, turning onto his side, drawing his knees up slightly, settling into a different configuration of comfort. The movement was unconscious, automatic, the body finding its own way through sleep's landscape. His breathing remained steady, unchanging, that fundamental rhythm that required no thought or will, just continuing on its own, breath after breath, maintaining life, keeping oxygen flowing, removing carbon dioxide, the ancient exchange that every breathing creature shares. The night held him. The darkness cradled him. And sleep carried him deeper still, down into its most restful depths, where healing happens and rest is complete. The hours continued their slow passage, each one marked by the church clock's chimes, but otherwise undifferentiated, flowing one into another like water into water. The night maintained its hold on the town, though the quality of that darkness was shifting in ways too subtle to name, too gradual to notice, unless one had been watching through all the hours since sunset. In Thomas's flat, the air was still and, neither warm nor cool, just the neutral temperature of a space well insulated and undisturbed. The darkness in the bedroom was absolute, the curtains blocking any light from the street lamps below, creating a space that existed outside of time, outside of any external reference that might suggest morning's approach. Thomas's sleep had moved through its various stages now. The initial descent, the deeper phases, the lighter moments of near waking that came and went without bringing actual consciousness. His body followed its own rhythms, cycles that operated beneath awareness, governed by processes older than thought, older than human consciousness itself. In sleep, the mind does strange work. It processes memories, filing some away permanently, discarding others, strengthening certain neural connections while letting others fade. It rehearses skills and movements, consolidating the day's learning. It generates dreams, those mysterious productions of the sleeping mind that feel so meaningful while they're happening but often evaporate upon waking. If Thomas was dreaming now, the dreams were his alone, private and inaccessible. Perhaps he walked familiar routes through transformed landscapes, delivering letters to houses that existed only in dream logic. Perhaps he encountered people he'd known years ago, now changed or unchanged in that peculiar dream way. Perhaps his dreams had nothing to do with his work or his waking life, but drew from deeper sources, older concerns, the fundamental human experiences of seeking and finding, losing and recovering, moving through space and time. Or perhaps there were no dreams at all, just the black rest of deep sleep, the mind quiet and still, processing nothing consciously, just resting like the body rested, claiming its necessary renewal. Outside, in the streets below, the town continued its sleeping. Most residents were deep in their own rest now, having passed through the lighter sleep of early night into the heavier sleep of these pre-dawn hours. Some would wake soon, shift workers preparing for early starts, people with internal clocks calibrated to rise before dawn, those whose sleep patterns had been disrupted by age or worry or habit. But most still slept, would continue sleeping for hours yet, would wake to alarm clocks or morning light, and begin their days without ever knowing what the town looked like in these particular hours, how the streets appeared in this specific darkness, what quality the silence held at 4:45 in the morning. Thomas knew, though. He knew these hours intimately, had walked through them thousands of times, had seen the town in all its nighttime variations, clear nights and cloudy nights, nights when fog rolled in from the river valley, nights when rain fell steadily and made the streets shine like polished stone, nights when frost formed intricate patterns on every surface. He'd seen the seasons turn through these nighttime hours, spring arriving with warmer air and the sound of returning birds even in darkness, summer bringing shorter nights and the scent of flowers, autumn gradually cooling and bringing that particular clarity to the air, winter with its longer nights and occasional snow that transformed everything into strange, beautiful silence. But he didn't think of these things now. He was beyond thinking, beyond awareness of seasons or streets or the work that defined his waking hours. He simply slept, his consciousness suspended, his body and mind both engaged in the necessary work of rest. The street lamps along Elm Street continued their steady burning, having illuminated the darkness for hours now without dimming or flickering. They were reliable, these lamps, part of the town's infrastructure, maintained by council workers who checked and replaced bulbs on regular schedules, ensuring that the streets were never left in complete darkness. A cat appeared on a windowsill across the street from Thomas's flat, a different cat from the others that had appeared throughout the night, a ginger cat with white markings. It sat in the window, looking out at the empty street, its tail wrapped around its front paws, its eyes reflecting the street lamp's glow. What it watched for or thought about was unknowable. It simply sat, patient and still, a sentinel at the window. After several minutes, it stood, stretched in that full-body way that cats have, and disappeared back into the dark interior of the house. The window was empty again, just glass reflecting the street lamp's light, revealing nothing of the life within. In the park, a bird called, just once, a single note that cut through the silence and then stopped. Too early for the dawn chorus. This was some individual bird waking ahead of its time, or perhaps not sleeping at all, calling for reasons known only to itself. The note hung in the air for a moment, then faded, leaving the silence deeper than before. The trees in the park stood motionless now, no breeze stirring their branches. They seemed less like living things than dark monuments, markers of vertical space against the horizontal spread of grass and paths. But they were alive, of course, sap flowing slowly through their cores even in winter dormancy, roots extending deep into the earth, drawing water and nutrients, maintaining the slow, persistent life that trees live across their decades or centuries. Some of these trees were older than the town itself, had stood when the land was still farmland or forest, had witnessed the town's growth from a few buildings to its current size. They'd seen generations of people born and die, seen buildings constructed and demolished, seen the slow accumulation of human history played out beneath their branches. But trees keep no memories, hold no records beyond the rings in their trunks that mark each year's growth. They simply exist, doing what trees do, growing when conditions allow, resting when they don't, producing leaves and seeds in their seasons, providing shelter and oxygen and beauty, without intention or awareness. Thomas's breathing had become even slower now, if that was possible, each breath deep and complete, the rhythm so steady it seemed almost mechanical, though it was entirely natural, just the body at its most profound rest. His heartbeat too had slowed to its minimum rate, that pace the heart adopts when the body is still and demands on it are minimal. It beat steadily in his chest, that tireless muscle that had been beating since before his birth and would beat until his death, never resting completely, never stopping, the most faithful servant any body has. In the living room, the books on their shelves remained silent and patient. They'd been read or waited to be read, held their contents securely, asked nothing, offered everything if someone chose to open them. Stories and facts and ideas and images, all preserved in words on pages, all accessible but dormant until a reader brought them to life through the act of reading. Some of these books Thomas had owned for decades, had carried from house to house, from his childhood home to his first flat, to the house he'd shared with his wife, to this small flat where he lived alone now. They were old friends, familiar companions, their covers worn from handling, their pages marked with the evidence of previous readings. Others were newer, acquired from the bookshop on the high street or ordered through the mail, not yet read or only partly read, still holding their secrets, their stories not yet revealed to him. He looked forward to them, to the quiet evenings when he would open them and enter their worlds, learning what they had to teach or show him. But books require waking to be read. In sleep, they're simply objects, paper and ink and binding, waiting for consciousness to return and animate them through the act of reading. The church clock struck 5. 5 chimes, clear and measured, marking another hour passed, another increment of night completed. The sound carried across the rooftops, entering through windows closed and open, heard by some, unheard by others, marking time for all whether they registered it or not. Thomas didn't wake. The sound reached him somewhere in his sleeping mind, noted and filed away, but insufficient to bring him back to consciousness. He'd heard that clocks strike every hour for years. It was part of the soundscape of his life, as familiar as his own breathing. The night was thinning now, though darkness still dominated. To the east, beyond the edge of town, beyond the fields and forests, the sky held the faintest suggestion of something other than blackness. Not light yet, nowhere close to light, but perhaps a lessening of complete darkness, a sense that somewhere, impossibly distant, dawn was beginning its approach. It would be an hour yet before that approach became visible here, before the eastern sky began to lighten perceptibly, before birds began their morning songs and the town started its slow return to waking life. For now the night still held. The darkness still reigned. And Thomas slept on, his rest deep and complete, his body and mind both lost in sleep's necessary work, far from the world of waking concerns, deep in the private realm where consciousness goes when it releases its daily grip on awareness. The stars above were beginning to fade, not from any approaching dawn but from the slight haze that had formed in the upper atmosphere, thin clouds moving in from the west, diffusing the starlight, softening the sharp brilliance they'd shown for most of the night. The moon had set hours ago. The stars were dimming, and still the darkness held, maintaining its patient watch over the sleeping town, keeping everything safe and still and quiet until morning came and brought back the world of light and activity. But morning would come in its own time. For now there was only this, the deep night, the profound rest, the sleeping town, and Thomas in his bed, breathing slowly, dreaming or not dreaming, held safely in the darkness, cradled by the night, deep in the restorative peace of sleep. The darkness held its ground stubbornly now, though time was working against it, slowly and inevitably eroding its completeness. The night had reached that peculiar stage where it was no longer deepening, but not yet yielding, suspended between its peak and its decline, existing fully but temporarily, like a held breath before exhalation. In Thomas's bedroom, nothing had changed. The curtains still blocked the window completely. The darkness remained absolute. The temperature stayed constant. His breathing continued its slow, measured rhythm, unchanged from an hour ago, from 2 hours ago. Sleep had settled over him like a blanket, warm and complete, and showed no signs of releasing him yet. His body had completed much of its nighttime work by now. Muscles had relaxed fully, releasing the accumulated tension of the day's walking. Tissues had repaired themselves where needed. The immune system had done its invisible work of monitoring and maintaining. The brain had processed and filed memories, strengthened important connections, allowed less important ones to fade. All this happened without conscious direction, without awareness or control. The body knew its work and did it faithfully, night after night, year after year, maintaining the complex machinery of life through its patient, automatic processes. In the streets outside, the emptiness was complete. No cats walked now. No foxes crossed the roads. Even the nocturnal animals had finished their hunting and returned to their dens or hiding places, settling in for rest before the day's activity began. The town belonged entirely to stillness, to that profound quiet that comes only in these hours before dawn. The street lamps continued their burning, but their light seemed different now, less necessary somehow, as if they sensed that their work was nearly done, that natural light would soon replace them. But they burned on steadily, following their programming, unaware of dawn's approach, simply doing what street lamps do, providing light in darkness, marking the hours through their patient glow. On Chestnut Road, the houses stood in their neat rows, each one containing its sleeping occupants. In one house, a woman turned in her sleep, reached for a glass of water on the nightstand, drank without fully waking, and settled back into her pillow, surrendering again to sleep almost immediately. In another, a man dreamed of flying, of soaring over landscapes that resembled but weren't quite the town he knew, the dream logic making everything familiar yet strange. On Birch Avenue, a dog woke and stretched, its claws clicking on the wooden floor as it walked to the door of the bedroom where its owners slept. It whined softly once, but received no response, so it circled and lay down again, placing its head on its paws, settling back into rest though not quite sleeping, just waiting with the patient acceptance that dogs have. On Harper Lane, the cottage with the thatched roof stood particularly dark and silent, like something from an earlier century, untouched by modern concerns or modern time. The roses around its door waited for spring, their bare branches holding the memory of summer blooms, patient in their dormancy, knowing without knowing that warmth and light would return eventually and call them back to growth. The stream continued its flow, unchanged and unchanging, its water moving in darkness, finding its way downward through the landscape, following gravity's persistent pull. The sound it made was softer now, or perhaps the quality of the air had changed in some subtle way that affected how sound traveled. Either way, the stream's voice was quieter, a whisper rather than a murmur, barely audible even to any who might have been near enough to hear. In the park, the bandstand stood empty and patient, its ornate Victorian ironwork dark against the slightly less dark sky. During summer days it hosted concerts, brass bands and small orchestras, amateur performers and occasional professionals, playing for audiences seated on the grass or standing nearby. But now it was just structure, just metal and wood, and the space they enclosed, waiting for music and people to give it purpose again. The pond at the southern end of the park held its water in perfect stillness, its surface like glass, reflecting nothing in the darkness but present nonetheless, home to ducks and fish that rested now in their own ways, fins barely moving to maintain position, eyes closed or half closed, surrendered to their own version of rest. Thomas's face was completely relaxed, all tension released from the muscles around his eyes and mouth, his forehead smooth, his jaw loose. In waking hours, faces carry the accumulated evidence of personality and experience, lines and expressions that reveal character and history. But in deep sleep, faces become simpler, smoother, return to something closer to their original form before time and experience shaped them. He looked peaceful, if anyone had been there to observe him. But there was no one, just the empty flat, the dark room, the sleeping man in his bed. The peacefulness was complete in itself, requiring no witness to be real. The clock on the church tower marked the quarter hour, 5:15 now. A single chime, gentle and brief, announcing the time to anyone who might be awake to hear it. But few were awake. The town still slept, would continue sleeping for perhaps another hour or more before the first alarm clocks began their work of calling people back to waking life. Those alarm clocks waited now in bedrooms throughout the town, set to various times according to various needs and schedules. Some would ring at 6, others at 6:30, others later still. Each one waited patiently for its designated moment, keeping time in its silent way, preparing to fulfill its purpose when the right hour arrived. But that hour hadn't arrived yet. The town still belonged to night, still rested in darkness, still maintained its profound quiet. A slight breeze had risen now, the first movement of air in hours. It moved gently through the streets, stirring nothing noticeably, just bringing a slight shift in temperature, a subtle change in the feel of the night. The breeze carried no scent particularly, just the neutral smell of cool air that had passed over fields and forests, picking up nothing distinctive, arriving clean and unmarked. The trees in the park felt the breeze first, their branches moving slightly, creating a soft sound like distant water or whispered conversation. The sound was soothing, natural, part of the night's own voice speaking in the language of wind and leaves. In Thomas's flat, the curtain moved very slightly, responding to some tiny draft that had found its way through the window frame's seal. The movement was minimal, barely perceptible, but it was there, a reminder that even in the most still environment, air moves, temperature shifts, nothing is ever completely static. But Thomas didn't notice. He was too deep in sleep, too far removed from sensory awareness to register such small changes. His consciousness was elsewhere, lost in whatever dreams or non-dreams occupied his sleeping mind, unavailable to external stimuli unless they were loud or urgent enough to trigger waking. And nothing was loud or urgent. Everything was quiet and calm and proceeding exactly as it should. The night moving through its final hours, the town sleeping safely, Thomas resting in his bed, the whole system functioning perfectly, each element in its proper place, each process following its natural course. The sky to the east was different now. Not lighter exactly, but less uniformly dark, showing the first hints of differentiation, the earliest suggestion that somewhere beyond the horizon, the sun was beginning its approach. Not visible yet, not even close to visible, but on its way, following its daily path, bringing morning with it as it had brought morning every day since the world began. But morning was still distant, still potential rather than actual. The night retained its hold, maintained its domain, kept the town wrapped in darkness and quiet for these remaining hours before dawn's arrival. Thomas slept on, his breathing slow and steady, his body at rest, his mind either dreaming or quiet, existing in that private space that sleep creates, that refuge from waking concerns where the self goes to renew itself before returning to face another day. The hours continued their passage. The darkness held but was changing infinitesimally slowly, degree by invisible degree. And the town rested, peaceful and still, held safely in the night's embrace, waiting without awareness for morning's eventual arrival and the return of light and activity and all the concerns and pleasures that waking brings. But that would come later. For now there was only this, the deep hours before dawn, the sleeping town, the quiet streets, and Thomas in his bed, lost in rest, surrendered to sleep, held gently by the night that was slowly, steadily, inevitably approaching its end. The night was entering its final hour now, though darkness still dominated completely, showing no obvious signs of yielding. The stars remained visible through the thin clouds that had moved across the sky, their light slightly diffused but still present, still marking the ancient patterns that humans had named and navigated by for thousands of years. In Thomas's bedroom, the darkness was as complete as it had been at midnight, the heavy curtains allowing no hint of what was happening outside, no suggestion that the night was aging, that dawn was approaching. Time existed here only as an internal experience, measured by heartbeat and breath, by the slow cycles of sleep moving through its stages, by the body's own quiet rhythms. Thomas had been sleeping for nearly 2 hours now, his rest deep and restorative. His body had found its most comfortable position, curled slightly on his side, one hand tucked under the pillow, the other resting on the blanket. His face was still relaxed, peaceful, showing none of the concerns or thoughts that might occupy it during waking hours. Whatever dreams he might have been having had faded now, dissolved back into the unconscious mind from which they'd emerged. His sleep was quieter now, approaching that final phase before waking, though waking was still some time away. His body knew, in its wordless way, that rest was still needed, that the work of the night wasn't yet complete. Outside, the first subtle changes were beginning. To the east, beyond the edge of town, the sky was fractionally lighter than it had been an hour ago. Not light, nowhere close to light, but perhaps a shade less dark, a hint that somewhere far below the horizon, the sun was climbing toward its daily appearance. A bird called from one of the trees in the park, a single questioning note, testing the air, checking whether it was time to begin the day's singing. But the note came alone, unrepeated, and silence returned. Not yet time. The bird settled back into whatever rest birds take during the night, waiting for the proper signal to begin its morning song. The street lamps along Elm Street still burned, though their light seemed less necessary somehow, less essential than it had felt during the deepest hours. They would continue burning for another hour or more, until the timer that controlled them decided that daylight had sufficiently arrived to make their illumination redundant. In the houses throughout the town, people continued their sleeping, though some were beginning to stir now, moving toward waking even if they hadn't yet opened their eyes. Internal clocks were checking the time, bodies were preparing to transition from sleep to wakefulness, though the actual moment of waking remained in the future. In one house on Meadow Way, an early riser's alarm clock was approaching its designated time. In 17 minutes it would sound, calling its owner back to consciousness, beginning the process of waking that would lead eventually to rising, dressing, breakfast, and the day's activities. But for these 17 minutes, the person still slept, still rested, still inhabited the private world of dreams and sleep. On Riverside Road, in the cottage near the stream, an elderly woman woke naturally, as she often did, in these hours before dawn. She lay quietly in her bed, listening to the familiar sounds of her house, the slight creak of settling timbers, the distant sound of water in pipes, the rhythm of her own breathing. She didn't rise yet, just lay there peacefully, thinking of nothing in particular, comfortable and warm, waiting for the day to announce itself more clearly before beginning her daily routine. The stream continued its flow, unchanged by night or approaching day, simply moving as it always moved, water following its ancient course downward toward the river. The sound it made was constant, patient, eternal in its way, the same sound it had made yesterday and would make tomorrow, and had made for thousands of years before any human built a house beside it or walked along its banks. In the park, the darkness was beginning to separate into shades, not obviously, not dramatically, but subtly, gradually. The deepest shadows under the trees were distinguishable now from the slightly less deep shadows in open areas. The bandstand's outline was fractionally clearer against the sky. The paths showed themselves as pale lines through the darker grass. These changes were still too subtle to notice unless one had been watching carefully through all the hours of darkness, seeing the infinitesimal shifts as they accumulated. But they were there, evidence that the earth was turning toward the sun, that morning was approaching, that the night's reign was ending. Thomas's breathing was beginning to change, becoming slightly less deep, slightly less slow. His sleep was lightening, moving from its deepest phases back toward the surface of consciousness. He wasn't waking yet. Waking was still perhaps an hour away, but his body was beginning the gradual process of returning to awareness, stage by slow stage, layer by gentle layer. In the living room, the books on their shelves waited in the darkness, patient as always, holding their contents securely. Soon, in hours, when Thomas woke and moved about his day, some of them might be picked up, opened, read. Or perhaps not today. Perhaps today would pass without any reading, and the books would simply wait, as they'd waited before, as they could wait indefinitely, their stories and information preserved perfectly until called upon. The clock on the church tower struck the half-hour. 5:30 now. One chime, brief and clear, marking the time. The sound carried across the sleeping town, reaching into houses and flats, heard by some, unheard by others, simply marking the hours as it had marked them for decades, as it would continue marking them long after everyone currently sleeping in the town had lived their lives and passed on. Time was something the clock tower understood in its mechanical way, the patient accumulation of seconds into minutes, minutes into hours, hours into days and years and decades. It had been marking time since 1887, its mechanism maintained and repaired but fundamentally unchanged, doing its simple work of announcing the hours to anyone who cared to listen. The breeze that had risen earlier was stronger now, moving more deliberately through the streets and gardens, stirring leaves and branches, carrying the sense of earth and grass and the distant promise of morning. The air was cold now, the coldest it would be before dawn began to warm it, and the breeze made it feel colder still, cutting through the stillness, reminding anything that could feel it that winter was approaching, that the warm days were behind and cold days ahead. But in Thomas's flat, the temperature remained constant, maintained by good insulation and walls that held the warmth generated during the day. The cold outside couldn't penetrate here, couldn't disturb the comfort of the sleeping space. Thomas remained warm beneath his blankets, his body temperature regulated perfectly, his rest undisturbed by external cold. A cat appeared on a rooftop across the street, moving with that characteristic feline grace and confidence, navigating the tiles as easily as it would navigate flat ground. It paused at the roof's peak, sitting to survey its territory, its ears rotating to catch sounds, its eyes scanning the empty street below. After a moment, it moved on, disappearing down the far slope of the roof, pursuing whatever business cats pursue in the hours before dawn. In the eastern sky, the change was more noticeable now. Still no real light, but a definite lessening of darkness, a suggestion of deep blue replacing the complete blackness that had dominated through the night. The stars were fading, not dramatically but perceptibly, their light overpowered by the approaching day. The town was suspended now between night and morning, no longer fully claimed by darkness, but not yet awakened to light. This transitional time had its own quality, its own particular feeling. Neither one thing nor another, but both and neither, a threshold time, a border between states. Thomas's sleep was lighter still now, though he remained unconscious, still resting, still deep enough in sleep that waking seemed distant. But the process had begun, the slow, gentle spiral back toward consciousness that would eventually return him to the waking world. His dreams, if they were present, were probably lighter now too, closer to the surface, perhaps more realistic and less symbolic than the deeper dreams of earlier hours. The sleeping mind was preparing for waking, adjusting its productions accordingly, beginning the transition that would eventually lead to consciousness. In houses throughout the town, other people were making this same transition, some slowly and naturally, others called abruptly by alarm clocks that shattered sleep with their urgent ringing. Each person's waking was unique, shaped by their age and health and circumstances, by how well or poorly they'd slept, by what awaited them in the coming day. But most still slept. The town wasn't yet awake, wasn't yet stirring into activity. These final hours of darkness still belonged to rest, to that profound quiet that had held through all the night. The night had nearly completed its work now, the work of providing shelter and rest, of holding the town safely in darkness while people slept and recovered and dreamed. Morning was approaching, bringing light and activity and all the concerns of waking life. But morning hadn't arrived yet. For these remaining minutes, these final fragments of darkness, the night still held. The town still slept. Thomas still rested in his bed, his round completed, his duty done, his body and mind both restored by sleep's healing work. The darkness was thinning now, slowly but surely, degree by degree, moment by moment. The stars were fading. The sky was changing. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the sun was climbing steadily upward, bringing with it the light that would eventually flood across the landscape, wake the town, and call everyone back to their daily lives. But that moment hadn't arrived yet. The night still held. The darkness still reigned. And Thomas slept on, peacefully and completely, held gently in sleep's embrace, resting deeply in these final quiet hours before dawn. The town breathed slowly around him. The streets waited patiently. The houses held their sleeping occupants safely. And the night moved steadily, inevitably, gently toward its ending, toward the moment when darkness would yield to light, when sleep would give way to waking, when the town would stir and rise and begin another day. But that was still to come. For now there was only this, the deep rest, the profound quiet, the sleeping town, and Thomas in his bed, breathing slowly, dreaming softly, wrapped in darkness and peace, held safely by the night until morning came and called him gently back to waking. The darkness held him. The silence kept him. And he slept on, deeply and peacefully, as the night moved through its final moments toward dawn. The story ends here, fading gently into continued sleep, allowing the listener to drift naturally into their own rest, carried by the rhythm and peace of the midnight postman's completed round.